Good afternoon and good evening to the rest of you. We are back for another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. It is I, your host, Q, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Alex McShane and Chris Alamo. And we're going to kick things off right away with a couple of colleagues of ours from Bitcoin Magazine. And we're here to talk CTV with Pete Rizzo and Aaron von Wirdum. I hope I said that right, Aaron. How are you guys doing today?
Not at all.
They're going to miss out of the gate.
Pete, I'd love to just sort of kick things off, I think, with a bit of an explanation. I think our back and forth before we started chatting could just be helpful to set the stage. Maybe share a little bit about what's really going on and what people are reacting to in this news.
Sure. So talking about OpCTV, of course, as you guys probably know, as Bitcoiners, Bitcoin is a software. It needs to be periodically updated, both to remove bugs and also to add new features. And the way that we add new features to Bitcoin is, I think, one of the processes of Bitcoin that remains kind of shrouded in the most mystery and, technical, like buried under technical layers of understanding. And typically how we introduce new features to Bitcoin is that developers propose a new software that integrates a new feature, and then users have to decide whether or not to upgrade to that new feature. And so that process now is in the early stages of going on in Bitcoin right now with a proposal called OpCTV, which is a soft fork proposal implemented in the Bitcoin improvement proposal, BIP 119, that would essentially add a certain type of new functionality to Bitcoin. And I'm sure Aaron can dive more deeply into what that is. So right now, you're really seeing that proposal come to the forefront, and Bitcoin users sort of being asked broadly whether they think it is worth updating Bitcoin and changing how it functions to incorporate this new rule. So we're sort of in the messy process of achieving social consensus across the thousands of people who run Bitcoin, making the sovereign individuals making decisions over their monetary software. I don't know, Aaron, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's a good intro. I can give a very brief synopsis of what this upgrade is precisely. So right now, basically, Bitcoins to Bitcoins you own, they are UTXOs. That's what they're called. They're UTXOs on the blockchain, essentially. And these UTXOs, they can be spent in a certain way. So you usually need a cryptographic signature. You might need other things, a time lock may have expired, or you might need several signatures, or you need like a secret code. Like there are conditions for you to be able to spend them. Now, once you meet these conditions right now on Bitcoin, then you can spend these UTXOs and create new UTXOs essentially any way you want. So let's say it's a 2 out of 3 multisig, just to name one example. You have 2 of the signatures. Now you get to decide how to spend them, where to spend them to, which addresses, what amounts go where, or what new conditions are there. All right, so this new upgrade, CTV, would actually limit this. So under CTV, even if you have all the conditions that you can spend them under, now, even then, you can only spend them in certain ways. So, for example, you can only spend them to certain addresses or certain amounts to certain addresses, or so it adds another limitation essentially. But the way to think, the right way to think about limitations is that it really sort of expands what you can do with Bitcoin. So, one example would be you can create a type of fault system where, let's say, right now, if your private keys are stolen, someone hacks into your computer, someone steals your private keys, now they can spend the coins any way you like. Now with CTV, that person who stole your keys can actually only spend them in a certain way. So for example, they can only spend them to your super cold storage that's in a vault somewhere, or there's like some kind of time lock. So by imposing limitations, you can actually better control your money. There's more flexibility of what you can do. So in short, it would extend the programmability on Bitcoin.
I just want to add one thing there. It's not in all cases. So if you got that impression, right, this is sort of something you can opt into as a user, right, Aaron?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's always the case. Anytime you accept Bitcoin, you are the one that decides under what conditions you're accepting the Bitcoin. So you create the address essentially that you could send to someone to send Bitcoin on, and hidden below the address, that's where all the conditions are. That's where you say this is a multi-sig, or this is a time lock, or in the future this is a CTV, so even more limitations. But it's always up to the receiver to decide under what conditions you receive Bitcoin.
So with that distinction right there, that debunks this sort of infinitely recurring OPSI TV kind of FUD that we've been hearing.
Well, CTV itself is designed to not allow that. So even under the current proposal, that shouldn't be possible. On top of that, my personal opinion is indeed that even if it were possible, it would be fine because you're still the one who's deciding under what conditions you're receiving. So some people are concerned about that regardless. They think there could be some sort of government pressure and people will only be allowed to receive Bitcoins in a certain way. I mean, I personally think that's a problem with or without CTV. Like you could, for example, think of a future where the government says you're only allowed to receive Bitcoins in a multi-sig address where we're part of it. And, so that sort of risk kind of exists either way. So I'm not really concerned about that. But even if you are concerned about that, CTV shouldn't allow that sort of recursive type of governance. So I don't think that's really a concern at all, really.
Yeah, Alex, I would even add, I think that's a great example of how this messy sort of consensus process, unfurls in the public, where not everyone really, I think, understands OPSI-TV equally at this point, right? And even myself, someone who kind of studies the history of Bitcoin, the history of software updates, right? I'm not qualified at a technical level to really evaluate OPSI-TV, right? I can expand about the process. And I think, really what you're seeing now is that some people have a really in-depth understanding of OPSI-TV, right? The specific proposer, developer, Jeremy Rubin, has done a great job sort of evangelizing for this and talking to people about it, but still it hasn't permeated everyone, right? So there's a lot of people who are very technical in Bitcoin who are just coming to this information and they're evaluating it sort of at the same time people who have evaluated for 6 to 12 months have, right? So you actually deal with the fact right now that you have people with different impressions about the software and they're arguing about it in public, and they may not even be saying things that are valid based on what the technical people think. So it's causing a bit of social chaos in Bitcoin if you've been on Twitter of late.
I have a follow-up question about that too. So why does it appear that the Bitcoin core maintainers haven't taken Jeremy's proposal into consideration until what seems like the 11th hour? Or is that not the case?
I would jump in there and I say that framing is one that off the bat, I think you need to kind of strip down the assumptions, right? So Jeremy Rubin, a core developer, works on Bitcoin, who coded OPSI-TV. Bitcoin Core is a larger software project, of which there are many different types of maintainers who work on different parts of the code. And there really isn't anyone who's in charge of sort of consensus upgrades, right? And this is what it is. It's like if you want to change a rule about Bitcoin, you sort of have to ask everybody, and then everybody who's writing the code gets to make some sort of choice by updating the new software. So in this case, there is no gatekeeper, right? There is no institution of Bitcoin Core that can sort of give a blessing to consider the proposal. So I think some of what Jeremy's been criticized for a little bit is being open about his experience within the process. Because I think what people find when they are Bitcoin developers is that Bitcoin has no process, right? And there are those in Bitcoin who actually would be concerned about there being a process, because if there was a process, then that would be something someone malicious could exploit. So there's sort of this long-standing process in Bitcoin where I think this would be the fourth kind of major soft fork to Bitcoin if it rolled out, and none of them have happened the same way, right? So there is no standard procedure. It's not like we have a list of steps that one should follow. And then even then, there are people who are opposed to having any steps, right? Some people would like to see every proposal that has changed Bitcoin go through some unique set of procedures. But there's this rough idea that there should be consensus, right? That there should be an overwhelming consensus that this is, a worthy way to change Bitcoin, right? And I think, that's kind of when I think about the list of questions I have with OPSI-TV, there's sort of this question right now of does it have consensus? And there's many ways, and maybe Aaron, I'd be interested to unpack in some ways you would attack that question. But I think that's the question right now. Does it have consensus? And I think it's clear that the Bitcoin core developers, it's they are Bitcoin users, just like everyone else. I think this is one of the misconceptions, I think, early on in Bitcoin that you have, is that developers and miners and users are kind of different parts. In reality, everybody's a Bitcoin user. If you believe in sort of the pleb ideology of Bitcoin, that everyone is equal, well, then who would even grant Jeremy's requests to be heard, right? Acts of standing up in public. I think Shinobi broke this down in a Spaces where he said, Bitcoin is the mob, and the way that you get Bitcoin to make a change is you have to yell, until the mob changes. And this is one of the things where, is Bitcoin a democracy? No. But it clearly requires some sort of, majority or supermajority consensus that something is the right decision. But then it also willfully sort of tries to avoid having any process for that, other than this idea that something should be just overwhelmingly non-controversial. So I don't know, I'll pass that over to Aaron.
So just to set a definition here based on what you said. So for the purpose of this conversation, a user is a node runner. Is that?
I mean, even then, now you're sort of drilling deeper into the void of what describes a Bitcoin user. Certainly, there are some people who would put forth the argument, and I think this has been a historically pretty sound argument, that if you do not run the Bitcoin software, you are not someone who is able to participate in social consensus, or certainly you can't signal or make an actual decision, right? So if someone were to introduce, two new pieces of software with sort of opposing rules, and then you weren't running the software, obviously, it would be hard to make your voice heard. So I think Bitcoin sort of struggles with this idea of, other than sort of introducing a software and sort of everybody upgrading it to it. That's sort of the hard fork model. In Bitcoin, we've navigated to this soft fork model. And so what is a soft fork? Well, really, in that case, you're usually tightening a rule, or Aaron can probably clear up. I'm going to say some things that are probably not technically super accurate here. Usually you're tightening a rule. And what you need in that case is for the majority of people who are running Bitcoin to be following that rule. And usually in that case, that means that it's safe for everybody to follow that new rule. And that means that you as a Bitcoin user, even if you're not following that new rule, it will be enforced and Bitcoin will be safe. And so really, the whole process of why do we have Bitcoin governance is because we're trying to introduce new features, we're trying to introduce new changes, or we're trying to do that in a way where the entire system doesn't break. And that's sort of the tricky part.
Yeah, lots of to unpack there. I'm not gonna comment on anything. I think your first question was, why haven't Bitcoin Core developers reviewed this proposal? And so at that point, you have to ask the question, okay, who qualifies as a Bitcoin Core developer exactly, and which Bitcoin Core developers exactly need to sign off to this? And there's not really a clear answer to that. Regardless, you could argue that, or at least some have argued, that not enough Bitcoin Core developers have actually looked at this and reviewed this. So if I'm going to answer that question, then I think, honestly, I don't think CTV is currently sort of engaging enough excitement. Like the perceived benefits are, kind of nuanced or kind of indirect, or there are some people that have use cases in mind for it, but some of the use cases would require a much bigger overhaul of sort of software infrastructure of exchanges and of wallets, and then there are other ways of potentially achieving these same kind of benefits, and there are other proposals that are sort of similar, and they're still kind of being weighed, and some people prefer, more less restrictive covenants, for example. So some people might actually want recursive covenants. So just as a very general answer, I think my impression is that within sort of the Bitcoin Core community, whoever is part of that or whoever is not, there's just not that much excitement for this upgrade. And then the second part, yeah, go on, Q. Oh, I thought you were gonna ask a question. Yeah, and then the second part, I think Rizzo was breaking this down pretty well. So the basic problem, I guess, is that an upgrade to the Bitcoin network or to the Bitcoin consensus has this inherent risk that it could split the network. Because if different nodes on the network are enforcing different rules, then it's possible that some nodes will accept a certain block or transaction as valid, and some nodes will not, because a certain transaction of block is breaking the new rules. So how do you resolve this? Well, you can resolve it with everyone has to upgrade at the same time. That's essentially what a hard fork requires. So we have a date, or we have a block height or something, and now everyone got to upgrade, because if you don't upgrade, the network would split. And then the other solution that is, a lot more pragmatic or practical is a soft fork, because a soft fork doesn't necessarily need everyone to upgrade at the same time. It really just needs that a majority of hash power is enforcing the new rules. All right, so that's why people generally prefer soft forks. But now the question is sort of emerging, what kind of consensus do you need for a soft fork? What is enough consensus for a soft fork? And that question has, multiple parts to it. Like, what is consensus? Does this mean consensus of users and who are users, or does it require consensus of developers and who are developers? And so that's where it gets really complicated. And I think that's still an unsettled question that is being explored as we move along in this Bitcoin journey, essentially. So there's kind of a new chapter there in a way.
I would jump in and I would say, I think the particular question that's being asked of OpCTV right now is, does it have technical consensus, right? And I think that's maybe why you're talking about the developers. So it's interesting because there's a couple ways to unpack that, is that there's no actual definition of technical consensus. So some of the people who are arguing right now, they have different definitions. And the two that I've really identified, I think, is, because as Aaron was saying, the process of going through this soft fork process is risky, it's time intensive. So now you sort of need to kind of have a gauge of like, okay, well, when is it worth going through this whole process of changing Bitcoin and mitigating the harm that could happen there? So you have this idea of, consensus. Some people also call it technical consensus. And so there's a couple flavors of that. One is that you might think that OpCTV would have technical consensus if no developers objected to it, or they didn't think it would do any harm, right? So that's what some people are saying when they're talking about technical consensus. And the other group of people I think are saying that, that's not enough. We need, like, most developers to think OpCTV is the best possible solution for what it's trying to do, that it's best in class, right? That of all the potential ways to kind of do the covenant style vault, locking up Bitcoin with scripts, of all the possible ways to do it, this is the best. And that's sort of the standard, right? And I think you sort of ask, well, why is there a standard of technical consensus? Because the Bitcoin software needs to be maintained, right? So you might think that, oh, well, Bitcoin core developers, what do they do all day? They just sit around and brainstorm new ways to use Bitcoin. Yes and no, they also actually maintain all the old code. So, if you introduce a new part of the code to Bitcoin, that has to be forever sort of checked for bugs and maintained. And there's been instances in the past where, people might not know this, like BIP70, there used to be sort of an invoicing type thing that was in the Bitcoin protocol. Kind of looks like what you get with Lightning today, but it was baked in the protocol. The developer who proposed it left, he was never around, it wasn't maintained, it had all these issues. So then they took it out, right? So because Bitcoin is a software we want to run forever, it is a different type of software than other older categories of software where, if you don't like iPhone 11, don't upgrade to the new one, just keep running iPhone 10. And then, someday later you'll have, iPhone 12. We really have never had with Bitcoin, it's kind of the first software where it's like, we think people will be running Bitcoin forever, right? They'll be using the Bitcoin money until the end of time. So that creates the software dependency. And so I think the developers really are having a conversation right now of like, does OpCTV have technical consensus? Do developers agree that it's a good enough idea? And then they're really saying these two specific things, which is, one, do they think it'll do any harm or introduce any risk? I think Aaron talked about that one. And then I think there's the second part of that is it best in class? Like, is it the best possible of all solutions for this? And so right now, I think Jeremy Rubin, the author, I think he's sort of claiming that, both A and B, right? He's saying it's not going to do any harm. Aaron addressed kind of your specific point about the attacks. And he's saying also it's best in class, right? He's saying this is the most minimal viable way to do this. It's not going to do these sort of Ethereum type script things. It'll be very complicated. It's actually really safe. And if you look at all the other different proposals for covenants, which is the class of proposals that OpCTV is in, this is the best one. So he's making both those arguments. And I think people are usually disagreeing with him on one or the other, or both, or that they support him, right? So there's that's kind of the range of opinions that you see currently right now in the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, to elaborate on that a little bit, one of the things Pete said is that the problem, if you want to put it that way, with a soft fork is you can't really undo it. The only way to undo it is a hard fork, and as mentioned, a hard fork requires basically everyone to upgrade at the same time, and that's at the very least very hard and maybe just impossible in Bitcoin. So if you're gonna implement a soft fork, you better be very sure that we want to have this in Bitcoin forever. That's why the bar is very high. The question at this point, as mentioned, is sort of, okay, but how high is high? How high is high enough? Which developers need to sign off? I do think there's sort of another layer to the discussion. So I think what we've been discussing so far is mostly what does an upgrade require to be implemented in Bitcoin Core. So this technical consensus and this developer process, and that's mostly about Bitcoin Core. But then you could technically implement a soft fork or even a hard fork outside of Bitcoin Core. Like it doesn't need to go through Bitcoin Core technically.
Well,
but so that's another, that's where it gets even more controversial. And arguably, like, one of the things Jeremy Rubin, well, he didn't try to do, but what he announced was, I'm gonna release this client that's gonna have miner signaling. So if a majority of miners, enforces a soft fork, then the rules are tightened, at least de facto, as long as they do that. So he was proposing to release an alternative client that would, activate this soft fork outside of the Bitcoin Core process, which is technically possible, but that's like a new kind of worms of, is that something that's desirable, or do we always want this process to go through Core first?
right. Yeah. A whole can of worms there. But I think, maybe how I'd break that down for people who feel a little lost, you have to run a version of the software. So if Bitcoin Core, and that technical process doesn't support it, in the past, people have proposed and written new software implementations that follow all the core rules and are compatible with Core, but again, have this new feature and then allow users to run this. So I think, when you're talking about, does OpCTV have technical consensus? We don't really know. But then the second kind of question now that Aaron, I think, introduced is sort of like, well, when is it okay for some developer who has a great idea to ask users or miners and to effectively poll them by asking them to run some other software, right? When do they have the right to do that? Or, how should people feel about if they do that? Because Aaron said in this case, Jeremy has not released the software, but what he has suggested is that he is going to code the software and release it, and now let users sort of decide or signal in some way that they want this. So it's sort of breaking from the ranks where, usually and generally, like I think all of the soft forks have gone through the Bitcoin Core process. They've been implemented in Bitcoin Core, and the network at large has never used or never made an upgrade by using some other software that has not gone through that process. Because, well, what is the process? Well, the process is all of the best minds and Bitcoin developers deciding something. So now if you're a developer who's releasing some other piece of software that is not going through Bitcoin Core, you're now asking the users to effectively run some piece of code that you now know is outside of that review, that has not really been given the express approval of those developers. So now you're sort of even on a higher level introducing more discord. And I think that's the other objection here where Jeremy's getting a lot of heat, is sort of he's saying, well, I'm gonna go to the users, right? If we don't have technical consensus on this, I think that it meets my definition of, it doesn't do harm, that it's best in class. So I'm just gonna go right to the miners. I'm gonna go right to the users, and I'm gonna ask them direct polling, direct democracy style. And now that's kind of ruffled feathers even further.
Yeah, and I got some.
To tie in there. So you said there that every soft fork so far has gone through Bitcoin Core. That itself is also a point of dispute, because we have seen the UASF in 2017.
Well, but the UASF was never run by the network, right? You can't say that the network has ever majoritarily opted into another software that has not gone through that process.
Well, you can say two things about that. first of all, you're right that we can't know how many people or what part of the economy was actually running it and was actually prepared to go along with it. And because that question was never really resolved, that's why that argument is sort of still going. And the other part, now we're getting another level deeper, is what actually defines a soft fork. Because what BIP 148, the USF in 2017 did, was it really sort of mandated the signaling, and then you can wonder if you require miners to signal to activate a soft fork, is that in itself a soft fork, or is that sort of scaffolding for a soft fork? We
should probably ask these guys what they think now, because I think this is like
yeah, I was just gonna say we should probably move at least one layer back.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say one thing. I do feel for Jeremy. I mean, this is definitely a rough process, and I think everyone would agree with that. I know, I guess I'm going to counter with something that Jeremy keeps bringing up, which is a great point. Right now, he's got a bounty for 5.5 Bitcoin, which is just over 200,000 at the current price in US dollars, in order to break CTV. So basically, he's like tempting other developers, maintainers, or anyone for that matter that knows how to code to break his proposal. And he's willing to put, a decent amount of Bitcoin, I would say, on the line to do so. I guess, is there any comments, Pete or Aaron, to that? Is that a good model? Should there be a different model for this?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of people who would say that, that Jeremy has done things in an interesting way. So I think in addition to evaluating Jeremy's specific technical proposal, the community is also confronting this idea that Jeremy has sort of advocated for OpCTV in a certain way, right? So in the past, most of the technical proposals on Bitcoin have really happened on the developer mailing list and with developers, like within GitHub and within that process. So when we say Bitcoin Core, you're really talking about the developers contributing to Bitcoin Core, having those technical discussions, and then ultimately deciding to integrate something in the software. Jeremy has done it a little bit differently, right? His sort of claim here is that like he's engaged with the industry wants this. He's also making the claim that developers are a bit out of touch with the industry by sort of not implementing new features that they want. And he's, created a website, he's created videos, he has like these graphics that explain what OpCTV does. He's had IRC meetings like about where people can talk about the proposal. He's put up bounties, and he's generally pushed forward the conversation into the public sphere in a way where users, I think, feel closer to this, right? They know that Jeremy is advocating for something and that this is a proposal that he's passionate about. I think what the developers object to in that is that there are other proposals in Bitcoin that are probably as popular right now as OpCTV, but they're not getting that attention. And one of the reasons they're not getting that attention is because Jeremy has advocated for it a certain way. So I think in addition to people feeling differently about OpCTV as a specific piece of technology, they're also feeling very conflicted about Jeremy's actual process, because in a certain sense, he's kind of politically campaigning for OpCTV, right? He's sort of created this way where he's almost looks like a politician. He's got this website, he's got his proposal, he's going to hit you on Twitter, he's going on Twitter Spaces, he's evangelizing for that. And that is in itself pretty new, right? We have not seen developers historically do that in the past. Even with Taproot, I mean, I'm sure you guys can't tell me like where that proposal came from, like who specifically proposed it. I mean, people who follow the mailing list, like we would know that. SegWit, kind of the same thing. This is the first time when really there's just been such a strong singular developer identity tied to this. And then he specifically sort of pushed that. And I think culturally, that just rubs a lot of the old kind of Bitcoin Core contributors. And again, these are the biggest names in the technical space, right, who have contributed, some of the biggest, advances to Bitcoin. That's rubbed them the wrong way, and they're not even engaging with it just because of the way the social signaling is taking place.
So if we back up for a second, using your kind of distinction, Pete, of monetary maximalism versus platform maximalism, Jeremy is without a doubt a platform maximalist, I would say. In his own words yesterday, I mean, Bitcoin will be at risk to fail and will not become the be all end all. And he might move to Ethereum if we don't put in this upgrade. So, I mean, what do you think about that? Do you guys think Bitcoin can sort of ossify right now, or do we need something like this?
I think
yeah.
Jeremy certainly has fans amongst people who don't think Bitcoin should ossify, right? Because one of the things that this specific OPCT proposal is getting a lot of positive attention for is it kind of presents this way forward where users are more like tightly integrated into this technical consensus process. So I think what Aaron was alluding to, so he was using some specific terms, I'll just break those down, like BIP 148, right? This was, back during like kind of the fork war period where it was unclear how we would upgrade Bitcoin. What happened was, technical consensus was reached. The miners were not signaling. So then what happened was the Bitcoin developers of the day sort of appealed to the users, or some subset of them did. So what happened during that event, and why it's kind of, you have to really study it to really understand the Bitcoin consensus process, is, again, the developers kind of all agreed on something, that something had technical consensus, that it was this best-in-class solution for the problem. The miners still weren't sort of signaling for it. So then someone coded a new piece of software that appealed to the users. And ultimately, what got SegWit activated was that people upgraded to SegWit, and they never really ran the software that the users were running, but people got the overwhelming idea that the users supported this and the developers supported this, so everyone upgraded, right? The industry sort of backed down. That process, like, it's not clear how that's scalable, right? It was a very acrimonious process. So I think what people like about what Jeremy's doing is that he's doing some flavor of that, right? He's saying, okay, we don't have technical consensus. I'm going to go about the software change in the same way that this previous software change did, where when there was conflict, we appealed to the users, right? And so now it's sort of introducing this whole other layer of, well, the real truth of that is the developers were never really, I think, totally on board with that, right? There's this idea that I think Q, in one of your earlier questions about, like, how are users involved in like the process of Bitcoin consensus and Bitcoin upgrades, it's actually pretty unclear. Like in cases like Taproot, they've actually totally been not really that involved, right? You have developers that introduce the software, they all agree that it's the best in class solution, and then sort of the miners are asked to signal that they would upgrade to the software, and then we make the change based on the miner signaling. That's why when you see the tweets like, oh, 80% of the miners are signaling for Taproot, yay, like, right, that's what's happening, right? It's like this hash power is being pulled, and then the change kind of goes through, and there's never a point where it's like you, Q, or you, Alex, and like your node like really matters in that conversation. So, you also have this like kind of meta layer of like, okay, when is it okay to just appeal to the masses, like your average Bitcoin node runner, and like, when is it okay to get them in there? So again, there's a lot of layers to this, right? There's like, what is technical consensus? When is technical consensus achieved? How do you feel specifically about Jeremy's, what he's doing, like both to kind of publicize this, and then 3, how do you kind of feel about his specific use of tactics, right, to really drum support of that? And I think there's criticism in every layer. And that's why there's no consensus here yet, as people are sort of unpacking this like, massive amount of information that's coming out.
I do kind of want to present this philosophical question to both you, Aaron, and Pete. I know you touched on it a little bit, but this idea that, like I am the least technically savvy person, I think, of this entire conversation and panel that we have today. Like, I would rather sort of understand and hear from people like Jeremy, like you, like Aaron, telling me, hey, this is what these changes can do. This is why it's good. And this is why maybe we don't need it. Do I need a say, though, in that decision-making process of like me being a Bitcoin user, where as we continue to scale Bitcoin out, like that's going to be the majority of Bitcoiners are going to just be like the general users interacting with layer 2 and above, not necessarily as many miners and developers. So the question really is like, do we need to give the developers that ability and right to just make changes that they see fit that would go over the everyday user's head?
Yeah, so the answer, in my opinion, is that in the end, developers do not and should not control the protocol or the consensus, and they also don't want that right now. So to be clear, the Bitcoin Core development process right now and for the past 10 years has worked pretty well, I would say. I think it's a fairly well functioning process, and I think the technical review and the code that they're producing, it works very well. However, it's not a viable long-term solution to sort of rely on that, because in the end that would represent a central point of failure. Developers can get lost in their own biases, or they can be corrupted or blackmailed, or something like this can happen. Now, if you look at how Bitcoin actually works, I don't know if there's an opinion or not. You could say it's an opinion, I guess, but
hard to know at this point.
The way Bitcoin actually works, in my opinion, if you want to call it that, is that there are really only two factions that matter. It's users and it's miners. Developers aren't actually a faction in the Bitcoin protocol or anything like that. It's users that value the coins, and the way they very specifically do that is by accepting transactions in a certain coin. And at that point, they also check the rules they care about, the rules that their full node is enforcing. So in that point in time, they are deciding what they consider to be Bitcoin and what they value. And then the miners, they mine blocks. They basically adhere to these rules. They produce new blocks that have these Bitcoins. So the only two factions that really matter in the end are users. Do you personally need to care about an upgrade like this? Not really. I don't know what you mean. Like, maybe you need to specify that question, because I'm not sure how to answer that right now.
Well, I think you're going down that thought path that I'm genuinely having, where it's like, while some of these changes right now today may necessarily be able to go over people's head because we're not at scale where everyone in the world and there are governments and businesses interacting on the Bitcoin network. But when we continue to scale out, if this practice of giving the developers just sort of this final say or ability to sort of circumvent the mass users, create a change that they see fit based on their understanding of the code beyond the way that you or I understand the code, for them to go off and do that in the future, the precedent this sets, to me, feels like a slippery slope.
Well, in a way, you are already caring. Like, you care about the rules every time you accept a Bitcoin transaction. Every time you accept a Bitcoin transaction, you're saying these are the rules I care about. So that's already the case. So there's no change in that sense. I think the real question maybe is like, if there's some sort of split potentially, what should you do? And I think at that point, the people that care should make sure that you don't get into trouble. So that's the miners, and the other users should make sure that you don't get in trouble. But right now, every time you get it, you are verifying the rules, as long as you run a full node at least, then you are. But it's perfectly fine to say as a user, you know what, I see the Bitcoin Core development process. I think that's not corrupted. I think that's working fine. So I'm going to download the Bitcoin Core software. And I think that's what a lot of users are doing. But even when you do that, that's still your choice, right? You are still deciding to trust the Bitcoin Core process. And I think that's a perfectly fine decision to make, at least so far.
I think the other part of your question is like, it has to do with this idea of ossification, right? Where some people think the idea that we wouldn't make any more changes to the Bitcoin base layer in the future is positive. And I think that's just a whole other can of worms, right? My personal belief, and what I've been trying to put out in my recent writing, and I think Alex alluded to a little bit, is that, we don't know how Bitcoin will function in the future, really. We don't, it needs to continue in such a way where, the participants of the network continue to operate that. There are a lot of different ideas about how that will work, right? Because there's only 21 million Bitcoins. At some point, the new Bitcoin being produced will go to zero. And we would hope that the incentives to keep the network together today would hold. We don't actually know those things. We can make claims or inferences about how that will happen. And there are plenty of people who say that the status quo right now is fine and could work into the future. And, there's nothing wrong with them representing that period. That opinion. My personal contention would be like, we have to continue going through this process, and because we're just not. There's no way to know if you're at the end of needing to upgrade Bitcoin. Therefore, it's better if the participants in Bitcoin are more educated about that, because Aaron said it's not this like theoretical thing. It is on some level, but at the end of the day, it's like you have to decide which Bitcoins to accept, and the actual vehicle for you to do that is the software. So I think Bitcoin going through this process, even if it is actively trying to destabilize and not have a process, is somewhat of a process, and that process I think is good for Bitcoin. We should continue going down there. And look, maybe CTV is just not interesting enough for everyone to kind of upgrade their software, and maybe it fails on that basis, or maybe it's rolled in with other proposals, right? So sometimes what's happened is that, with Taproot, it wasn't just Taproot, it was Taproot and Schnorr signatures, right? So there was multiple proposals that kind of came together, and both of those were upgraded at once. So there's a lot of things that could happen here, right? There's nobody, I think it's way too early to tell whether like OpCTV would go in by itself, whether it would fail, whether it would be batched with other things. Certainly, like what you can say right now is that people are talking about it. I think that's good. I think it's good for people to be involved in the technical workings of Bitcoin and to understand how Bitcoin functions, because there are tons of unanswered questions here, right? As me and Aaron have just been talking, there's a lot about Bitcoin governance theory and, how it functions that just, we probably won't know the full answers for a very long time. And we as Bitcoiners who want to see Bitcoin succeed in the future, the more knowledge we have of that process, I would argue the more secure Bitcoin is, right? Because ultimately you don't want to trust anyone. That's the core ethos. So how do you not trust anyone? Well, you're as informed as possible. That's the best defense you have.
Yeah, but even if you're not, so I think one of the nice things about Bitcoin is that the incentives really do align very well. The incentives, the economics, the game theory. So that's one of the reasons we do soft forks in the first place. It's better to not kick anyone off of the network. It's better if we make an upgrade and you, Q, can still pay me and I can pay you, even if I am upgraded and you're not yet. So there's a very strong incentive that basically the people that care and the miners, like I mentioned, they have a very strong incentive to keep you who don't understand or don't care, to still keep you on the network. So in that sense, I'm not really concerned, even if people don't want to learn about this, or even if because the incentives are so strong to keep you on the network. That said, it would be even better if everyone, does learn about it and does, potentially upgrade to a new client if they feel that better represents their values, or if that better represents the way they want to see Bitcoin develop or grow.
So Jeremy's proposal is very forward thinking, concerned about the future. I would say, these aren't Bitcoin operates perfectly well without OpCTV. What do you guys think about these kind of, especially with the mempool congestion control use case and some of the problems he's trying to ward off very early?
Well, you can never really tell how software is going to be used, right? He's proposing a change and then it's sort of being put on him and saying, okay, well, what can you do with this change, right? And so that's what he's tried to circulate and get mind share around, and where he's really being challenged. I think what's interesting about his particular appeal is, again, you sort of go back to the beginning. One of the things that Jeremy's sort of saying here is that, this is the type of upgrade to Bitcoin that isn't for everyone, that it's actually only going to be used by the industry, right? Like Aaron was saying, to create these new types of vaults, these are services. This is like the kind of stuff that you would rely on a Casa or an Unchained right now, but it's coming into the base layer. It can be done trustlessly. It can be done in a programmatic way, right? So he's making a much more narrow argument where it's what's interesting about CTV is he's saying, yeah, this isn't for everybody. These past upgrades are actually a little bit different. Yeah, everybody, benefited from SegWit, everybody benefited from Taproot, and everybody will continue to benefit of the advances here. He's saying that's not the case. He's saying this is really for the industry. This is for the industry to offer some better services. And sort of he's making the appeal, I think, that Bitcoin developers have sort of ignored that, and maybe that this is sort of a path forward, but even that's sort of very debatable, right? Because I think some people are fighting him on this idea, well, if it isn't for everybody, if everybody doesn't benefit from this type of new technology, well, then why are we making this upgrade? Why go through all the trouble when, clearly this is something that requires like a really high standard? So maybe I would just push back and say, like, I don't really have any specific opinion on like the specific use cases that he's put forward. I think it's interesting that he's arguing that the use cases really are for a certain class of Bitcoin users, right? And so you mentioned mempool congestion. So, Jeremy's defended that and said, yeah, the kind of person who's opening up thousands of Lightning channels, they might want to send one transaction and then ensure that these other 1,000 channels will open and that those will eventually confirm. That's a great use case, right? So it's incumbent on him to get that kind of mind share around these use cases. But I do think it's interesting that his argument here is like very specific. He's saying these are industry specific use cases. Maybe everyone won't benefit from them, but still everybody should upgrade. Still, this is good for everyone. And in that way, this is what is making OpsCTV a little bit unique, and it adds a little bit of flavor to Jeremy's specific critique. And it's just another kind of differentiating factor here where we haven't seen something like this before quite in Bitcoin.
I think in general, the Bitcoin users, they want to see the value of Bitcoin go up, and Bitcoin miners want to see the value of Bitcoin go up. And that's why I think in general, if a change will make the value of Bitcoin go up, it will probably happen one way or the other. So maybe it will go through Bitcoin Core, or otherwise someone...
Has there been a change that has made the value of Bitcoin go up?
Yeah, I think SegWit, for example, has probably made the price go up, right? Or you don't think so, Rizzo? You think the whole deployment of the whole Lightning network, that was irrelevant for the price of Bitcoin?
I don't think it was possible for that to have been priced in at the point of SegWit. And Lightning was still technically possible without SegWit, right? It was just more cumbersome.
Anyways, well, we can figure this stuff out with futures market. This is my pet. How do we call it? This is my personal war I'm fighting. You're
bringing it back. I love it.
It's Scorch's original idea, but that's what we really need, I think, for futures.
Go into it. Do you want to explain your futures proposal?
Yeah. So essentially, the very basic example is that if you have, let's see, where do I start this explanation? So if there's a potential split in the network, so in this specific case, you could have a software that will have CTV for sure, like it would be a UASF basically, that will definitely activate CTV. And then you have a software that will definitely not have CTV. So there will essentially definitely be a split in the blockchain. So there will be two Bitcoins, at least virtually. Like these software projects will definitely split the blockchain. All right, now these fork futures will allow you to trade between these two versions of Bitcoin. So you can trade between Bitcoin with CTV and you can and without. So if you have Bitcoin, you can sort of split them virtually and you buy one or the other. Now, after the split happens, the one you bought is the one you get, and the one you sold is the one you don't get. So I think this, this allows people to really put their money where their mouth is. They really say, I want this Bitcoin. And you'll see a virtual price of which Bitcoin will be considered to be more valuable. I suspect in general, because it's really hard to actually split the blockchain and to actually have two viable Bitcoins because of the difficulty adjustment and because of the network effects. I personally expect that any futures market like this will have a very binary outcome. So there will be a very binary outcome that says, all right, this is where the market wants Bitcoin to go, or that's where the market wants Bitcoin to go. We have an example of this. So this happened in 2017 when the 2x, the SegWit 2x group, I'm not going to explain what that was, but some of you will know, some of you will not. But some people wanted to increase the block size, and that would have split the blockchain. And there were fork futures for that, so people could trade the future value of these coins, and you saw a very strong binary effect towards keeping the status quo and not having a split. And the people that were backing the 2x project, they eventually even backed off. They said, all right, we were wrong, the market doesn't want this, so never mind, we won't do it. And I personally expect that to be a very typical outcome of these fork futures. So this is a way that you can really poll users, you can really poll the market to see where it wants to go, and that's something that miners can see. All right, that's where the market wants to go. The market wants CTV, so we're going to activate CTV, and then we'll have CTV because miners also want to make money. So that's sort of my personal vision for how I see Bitcoin governance play out. Now, I want to emphasize this doesn't preclude anything else. You can still have the Bitcoin Core process. You can still have arguments on Twitter. You can still have all of that. And I do suspect that the futures markets will probably, the market will probably have very much respect for the Bitcoin Core process as long as the Bitcoin Core process works. So as long as the Bitcoin Core process is making good decisions, is not rushing things, is not implementing anything that people don't want, or is not implementing something that has consensus. Like, as long as that process works, then I suspect the futures market will also show that. But you could see it as a way to keep the Bitcoin core process honest, maybe. But yeah, that's sort of the short version. Does that make sense?
Yeah, ultimately, I think it's a way to, why people have always kind of defended this process is this idea that, you can argue about all you want, but it's like, are you willing to put your Bitcoins up and lose them if the specific proposal didn't go through, right? So Aaron alluded to, like, in the past with SegWit upgrade, this had happened. And really what you saw with that is, like, people were willing to put up their Bitcoin and then potentially lose them in order to get SegWit, right? And that sort of sent a signal to the market that, oh, people don't want this, double block size increase. Like, people are willing to lose their Bitcoins for this other thing. It just sends a stronger signal, right? And it's just one of the tools that people have suggested measuring consensus. But again,
it's not just losing, of course, it's also making more
winning,
of the other one.
Right.
Yeah. So some people ended up with more Bitcoin because they bet on the status quo in that specific scenario. Some people have like 15% more Bitcoin, or whenever they made the trade, if they timed it well. I don't remember the exact amounts, but so there's an incentive both negatively and positively. It's trading, it's like trading between anything else. In this case, you're trading on what do you think the future of Bitcoin should be, or what do you want it to be, or what do you think will be more valuable.
Yeah, and really all these things are just tools, right? So Bitcoin, again, I think I saw someone from the Ethereum community kind of pop into the Bitcoin spaces talking about CTV, and they had some interesting direct comments, Harry, to me after, right? This is one of the things that differentiates Bitcoin, right? I think a lot of the other cryptocurrencies, they have this process where the users are very deferential to developers, right? The developers set this roadmap, and in their worldview, what you as a user have, essentially by buying the coin and running the software, you've bought into their roadmap, right? So they're sort of used to giving themselves this carte blanche ability to say, well, if we change the roadmap, well, then if you don't agree, you can just sell and leave, right? Bitcoin does not have that, right? Bitcoin has a process by which really the users are ultimately controlling Bitcoin. And if there isn't an overwhelming consensus, this is good for everybody, regardless of what the developers or founders think. And it means that we have this messier process, right? It means that we have this process where there isn't a process. There's just a bunch of tools that we've used before to kind of understand whether people ultimately want to run this different type of software. But I think it's important to kind of contrast this with, right? Right now, we're having a vibrant social discussion about proposal. And I think that's shocking to a lot of the other cryptocurrencies who, in 2017, they thought Bitcoin was dead. They thought Bitcoin, couldn't integrate new features. They thought that Bitcoin would never upgrade again. And this was the way that they would kind of outcompete them. And now they're seeing kind of, 6 months after Taproot, Bitcoin's having another discussion about another proposal, and that we're still moving forward, even though we sort of lack this like process, right? We lack this like, this is one guy, one developer who came up with a smart idea. He's proposing and he's evangelizing and he's getting mind share. And even though that conversation is tough, maybe it doesn't happen. It's still happening in a way that's like much more organic than is happening in like any other cryptocurrency community, where it's a lot more controlled, right? Something that is happening amongst the developers. The developers are working on a roadmap. There's a tight deadline. With the merge, like you got to make the merge with Ethereum, right? You're going to have to upgrade your software whenever the developers tell you to get ready for that merge. So again, I think for people who are just coming in and just seeing this mess, like it is a mess, right? It's a mess. But it's a group of people trying to come to consensus without authority, right? There is no authority here, and this is the secret sauce, right? And I think I kind of had to remind this Ethereum developer or kind of tell him, and it's like, look, if you haven't been paying attention to Bitcoin development, I mean, it's actually advanced quite a lot, and it has advanced without needing to this trust and this level of authority that other structures had. And really that's, I think, the thing that, really makes me continue to be confident in Bitcoin as opposed to the other projects.
Awesome, guys. I know there's a lot that we discussed here and a lot still left to continue discussing. I'm sure there'll be more updates out of all the CTV news. And we'll be sure to keep an eye out for any and all shit posting that the two of you get up to on Twitter in regards to this news, and we'll probably have you guys back. In the meantime, though, we're going to cut to a quick commercial break before we are joined by MacKenzie Sigalos from CNBC to talk Bitcoin in the mainstream media. So stick around. You're not going to want to miss that conversation, guys. What is up, guys? We are back, and I'm joined by MacKenzie Sigalos from CNBC, and we're here to talk about Bitcoin and the mainstream media. MacKenzie, how are you doing today?
Hey, good.
So I want to start things off. Like, Bitcoin gets thrown around in so many conversations, both pro-Bitcoin, anti-Bitcoin, and everything in between. We've seen mainstream media go from being very anti-Bitcoin to sometimes even having reporters like yourself share, the real story behind Bitcoin, not necessarily saying it's pro or anti, but just, finally hearing the truth about Bitcoin. Maybe share with us a little bit about, some of the conversations that you had early on about Bitcoin, just overall throughout the mainstream media landscape.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when I first started covering this in 2017, the conversation was more about Bitcoin in the context of markets and price moves. And that's when we saw this bull run. And then we went into this crypto winter, and there was less of a focus on coverage of cryptocurrency in general, Bitcoin. And then we started to come out of that at the end of 2020. And that's when I got back on this beat and was able to cover it in a dedicated way starting around this time last year. And I made this move into a tech reporting role. And at the time, they didn't really know what they wanted it to focus on, whether it was cybersecurity or enterprise reporting. And I just knew that I really wanted to make this beat about cryptocurrency. And a lot of my focus has been on Bitcoin in particular. And so in terms of like mainstream media's take on how to cover this space, I think that it's evolved from it being a very markets driven focus where a lot of the emphasis is on price moves and understanding like, what is moving the charts today, to an interest in like the tech and what's going on underneath it. Like I had a story doing, like when I first started out in this role, I was covering Taproot when it first locked last spring, and it was like it led the site over the weekend. And I've covered other like what I thought might be too technical, too in the weeds, like too specific to one side of this narrative, and it really resonates with a general like business news audience. That's been a really like cool surprise for me. And it's really like opened the doors in terms of being able to cover more of that side of the narrative.
I'm curious too, because like you touched on just right now how like you wrote this piece about Taproot, not expecting it to really gain any traction. Here it is getting eyeball after eyeball. Is that really the driving force, or what would you accredit to sort of this shift in mentality and focus from number go up, number go down to like, what is this technology and how can we use it day to day?
Yeah, I think it's a credit to the audience, right? Like there's just this evolving appetite for understanding how Bitcoin works, not necessarily as a speculative asset to make a bet on, but just, as a monetary system, as a payments network, the energy side and the mining side of this network, which actually secures the entire system. So I think it's interesting to see that readers genuinely care about that. And it's not just, like certain upgrades, like there are other nuances of the wider crypto ecosystem. And I know in this conversation, we're focusing on Bitcoin, but like, we've just realized that there is such an appetite for like, how do the fundamentals work? And so it was a very cool surprise on our end.
I'm gonna poke this as carefully as I can, because we are a Bitcoin only show and I've been ripped apart for saying anything other than Bitcoin plenty of times before, but that doesn't stop me. Why in mainstream media is there this push to like clump Bitcoin into the same category as crypto? Do you yourself see Bitcoin as crypto, or do you see it, like many of us in this space, as two separate types of technology?
I think that it's a different kind of technology. But to answer your first question, why is it lumped in the mainstream media? Because when you're breaking this down for the layman, the digital assets as a new class of asset, like the crypto asset class, is seen as a collective umbrella term. And of course, Bitcoin being a first mover and the most decentralized and like the most secure, because it's intentionally kind of moves slowly to not break things as you go. Its first mover status is why we focus on that as a big part of this narrative. But it also was a first mover that then led the way for other cryptocurrencies. And so it's a good way to put it in context. And so then people are interested in some of the newer blockchains. And so we explain it again in the context of, here's how it compares to a Bitcoin, and it Bitcoin as a coin, as a network. Like it's helpful to be able to draw those parallels because of the fact that Bitcoin was first to the game.
And there's also the fact that it's more decentralized. It's not a security, whereas all the other cryptos register as securities. Do you recognize that distinction between kind of Bitcoin and everything else out there?
Yeah, I think that, I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday just about the, property versus security debate, what in the SEC's role. And I mean, it's obviously an evolving narrative as like the US government also catches up to decide how they want to classify it. And at this point, specifically within the bounds of the US, it's seen as a property. So any kind of, event where you use your, buy a house in Bitcoin, that's a taxable event because you're essentially liquidating your stake to buy something. So did I answer your question? I feel like I just went in a different direction, like talking about the IRS.
Yeah, I hear the IRS and SEC distinction, but I personally think it would be helpful if mainstream media kind of learn to recognize that, where they tend to conflate the two terms, but they're completely different things, because Bitcoin cannot disenfranchise its users based on the will of a few, whereas all the other cryptocurrencies can, because they're securities that are run by venture capitalists.
I think, one thing that you just talked about, like Bitcoin not disenfranchising users, like that's been the most interesting thing for me in the last year in terms of like different areas that I've covered. So we've talked about how I've like gotten into tech upgrades and they're, like the mining side of it, but I've also looked at like the use case for when Bitcoin in particular is helping systemically disenfranchised groups have an on-ramp to the economy, like their only access to online banking. And I, like in the context of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan last year, I was looking at a couple of different use cases with respect to like earning an income, like off-ramping cash as people fled the countries, like the traditional banking system collapsed around them. And then you saw that exact same narrative in different ways play out in Ukraine. And I mean, it's just, that is what I think is especially impactful when you think about the ways that Bitcoin is being used today.
Do you feel though that like these broader conversations of, yes, we are educating people and letting them know this technology has expanded and has essentially opened the door for all of these other blockchains to essentially be formed off of the heels of Bitcoin? But we also see it time and time again, especially those of us who spend a majority of our time in this space, of the classic scams and rug pulls and everything else that essentially leaves people with a bitter taste in their mouth when they hear even just the word Bitcoin or crypto at large. Like, do you not feel like as part of the media, we have a responsibility to be educating these people as best we can?
I think we are. I think that like our audience is savvy and they realize that decentralized finance is different to Bitcoin. And they realize that the blockchains that are, suffering security breaches are separate to Bitcoin. I don't think that people are conflating that all these blockchains are the same. And, Bitcoin is just as, is subject to the same kind of security flaws as other blockchains that have these like huge hundreds of millions of dollar hacks. I think that we are like, at least in the work that I'm doing, like educating people about, why certain blockchains are more susceptible, like are more vulnerable in general. And so one, I think we are trying to do that, like kind of point out that there are differences here. And two, I think we have to give the audience credit for understanding that like DeFi is not built on, like the largest blockchain is still Ethereum. Obviously, Solana has become a huge player in the world of decentralized finance, but I think that people understand the distinction. And for those who don't, we're like continually pointing it out in stories as we cover that.
Fair, but I will never allow things like Solana to be considered decentralized finance, given the fact that they're not decentralized and they have a central point of failure. I think whoever the PR person that came up with the slogan DeFi is just spinning everyone out. And like, that's a word that I personally would like to see taken out of the nomenclature, because none of those are decentralized financial protocols with the exception of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is not categorized based on the current definition as such. I don't want to spend all of our time debating the minutiae of that. You touched a little bit on how.
Well, wait. Before you move on, like I do think that I think it's something I've looked into with respect to Solana, because I do think that's interesting. Like a lot of people do tout the fact that it is so fast and it is so cheap in terms of the cost of transactions. But there is a trade-off for that, and there is a question of centralization. So I've had conversations with people on both sides of this debate, and there are, I think it's very interesting what you've pointed out. It's something that I'm still reporting on right now, and I do plan to cover. So yeah, an interesting point. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. I didn't want to like put you on the spot having this conversation, which is more why I presented it like that. I would highly recommend you take a look, and we can sidebar about this. I'll email you which episode it was specifically. There's an all-in podcast where both Chamath Palihapitiya and David Sachs point blank admit that they have pre-mined so much Solana that they are now Solana billionaires in their own right, and now have to figure out how to start unloading these coins. But it's not part of the total, like the total float of the Solana tokens that are out there on the marketplace right now. So it starts to beg this question of, okay, are we like just witnessing yet another rug pull? While it's said it's faster or whatnot, it's definitely, if you're diving into it, I highly recommend just like dissecting that a little bit more, because it again brings back this notion of, is this actually decentralized or not? And
right, decentralized in name only.
Or in branding and marketing only, not even in name. In my opinion.
if you want to call something like Solana decentralized, okay, fair enough. But then you need a totally new term for Bitcoin, which is exponentially more decentralized, as the cost of running a node is, far cheaper, and there are tens of thousands of us running them.
That is the other side of it, the cost of running a node, and then some of the other, how they're able to move so fast, like some of the basic protocols of the kind of the underbelly of it. I agree. Send me the episode. I think it's an interesting point that you just made about, and that idea of like VCs owning large swaths of Web3 is something that's also been brought up by the likes of Jack Dorsey, and just, this idea of it being a decentralized version of the web. Like, you also have to consider who has skin in the game with respect to investments, which is another point that I think is interesting that has been made that I'm looking into.
Awesome. Well, we do appreciate everything you do. I think you are one of the few people out there who's genuinely reporting on the facts and not conflating things for the sake of story. Your articles dissecting just the way Exxon was expanding into Bitcoin mining, I found very fascinating. But before we go on to just mining in specific, I do want to talk some legislative stuff with you. You touch a little bit on the fact that, we're all sort of waiting for the day when the IRS or whoever the powers may be finally dictate and say to the world, hey, everything else is a security and Bitcoin itself is an asset class. I'd love your thoughts just generally of what you're paying attention to out of DC, or any legislative efforts that are really taking up your focus right now.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a couple of different things that have been really interesting as of late. I think that everybody saw the Biden executive order as a huge win for the industry. And then the conversation swiftly took a hard right turn to New York and what's going on there. And so that's what I've been paying a lot of attention to this week. I'm working on a story about it right now, and it is mining specific. So I don't know if you want to wait to talk about it, but that's hugely important in terms of like legislative movement that's happening within the US. It's similar to a measure in the EU that was being considered with respect to, stamping out proof of work mining operations, which is which is virtually synonymous with Bitcoin mining and securing the network. So those, with respect to regulation, those are the things that I've been thinking about a lot. If we want to hold off on getting into the mining side of things, the one other point that I'll make is that I think what was so interesting was in August of last year, $1 trillion rubber stamped infrastructure bill was held up for a week and a half by a voting contingent that I think a lot of people didn't even realize was there. And so I've increasingly been having these like more, politically minded conversations with people at like Bitcoin Miami. And I was at a dinner the other night and I met somebody who's running for office for Congress in California on, it's not Bitcoin specific, but it's a crypto platform. And what I find interesting is that you have these groups of people who are raising a lot of money to support candidates who are pro-Bitcoin and pro-cryptocurrency more generally, but also to support candidates who just don't speak negatively about the industry in general. So like, it's like just voting out Bitcoin haters. And it's just, I think it's fascinating. I mean, we're going into midterms later this fall. And so the importance and the relevance of this, this Bitcoin voting contingent, I think is hugely relevant, and also in a way that people weren't talking about it before August now they are. Sorry, that was kind of roundabout, but
no. I love that. I was taking notes of so many different jumping off points that we're about to dive down, but I want to start first with, what are your expectations? Respectfully, I know you're not spending your time on the political space, but like, we're seeing Bitcoin, as you've mentioned, and crypto at large become a big talking point for politicians, especially now. How much do you think this is going to take center stage in this year's midterms? And do you think this could be something that swings the House or the Senate in a specific direction?
Yeah, I think that down the line it could. Do I think it will be like the go-to issue this fall? No, but it's increasingly important. And like you look at what's being said by, Mayor Francis Suarez was really like the first to, among the first movers. Texas has incredibly crypto progressive, Bitcoin progressive politicians. When you think of Governor Greg Abbott, Senator Ted Cruz. I spoke with the mayor of Fort Worth, who just literally started her own Bitcoin mining operation inside City Hall. In New York, politicians skew different ways, but at least their new mayor, Eric Adams, is supportive of the industry generally. So I do think it's interesting to see how politicians now realize that like they need to have a stance on it either way, and like there are a lot of spoke with Senator Lummis a couple of weeks ago about like the very progressive views that she has and the way that she's kind of instituted this open door policy for different sides of the industry and why that's been good for the state.
I was laughing hysterically at the idea that Eric Adams is anything more than, in my opinion, a grifter for votes, telling people that he's pro Bitcoin, and then immediately saying, "Oh, I'm pro Bitcoin and Ethereum." And here we are now with them about to pass through legislation to essentially say Bitcoin mining has these restrictions based on clean energy usage. I'd love your thoughts. Like, you spend a lot of time reporting on the mining. You've seen firsthand the way miners and those developing new techniques to capture energy are figuring out ways to offset their carbon footprint as a result. Do you think that this is going to help that initiative, or do you think this is going to hold back Bitcoin? And I'll even open the door to just broader crypto development in the state of New York.
Yeah. So the thing is, for those who where we are on this legislation, and what they're proposing is a 2-year moratorium on permits for proof of work mining that that runs on power plants powered by fossil fuels, right? So it's pretty limited in the scope of what it's saying, and it's to issue new permits, and then it would block the renewal of existing permits, and it wouldn't let existing operations expand their footprint. And so you think, okay, well, it's only blocking out like this one particular type of power source. And hey, there are a lot of like renewable run Bitcoin mines in New York. There's a lot of hydropower. There's nuclear power that's used. So there are a lot of like green energy sources in New York, and that's a different conversation. But the thing is that when you stamp out this this corner of the industry, it does a couple of things, right? So one, it scares people. So they think, okay, well, we don't really have crypto-friendly policymakers. And yes, this is where it starts, but where does it go from here? Does this kind of like open the door to more aggressive legislation that could completely like block out the industry? So then like new players think, well, maybe I won't get involved in New York. Let me go to a different state. So it shifts the hash rate elsewhere. And New York is a huge player, not just nationally, but like on the world stage. Like I've seen some pretty high percentages with respect to the share of hash rate that is specifically coming out of New York. So then what are the drawbacks to a lot of miners leaving New York? Well, it's not just that they would shift elsewhere and that, perhaps like hydropower that otherwise would have been used for this will, that operation will shift elsewhere. New York is a first mover with respect to policy. So I think that the other concern that's come up is that, hey, like, New York, if they pass this, they've written the blueprint that then can be used by other states. And so then there is this ripple effect across the country. And, I was having this great conversation with Perry-Ann Boring of the Chamber of Digital Commerce earlier this week. I'm going to look at so she was basically making the point that the sustainable energy mix of the global Bitcoin mining industry today is estimated to be just under 60% globally. And like their estimates for New York specifically is that the number is closer to 80%. And so the thing is that as you start to shut down this industry, you're kind of going to shut out a lot of that. And there's so many more nuances to that, but that's kind of where I think we should start with respect to what's going on in New York.
No, please feel free to expand on that. That is genuinely my fear, is that like you're creating these restrictions to stifle innovation. And now you've introduced a new level of fear all of a sudden. People are disincentivized to come to your state. And then meanwhile, you have a state like Texas that is continuing to push forward pro-Bitcoin legislation. You have the first city official and government in America mining Bitcoin. Like that is a signal to many Bitcoin companies to come to Texas. And at the same time, like, being given the bird by the city or the state of New York. Oh, I think you're frozen. Oh, she is definitely frozen. All right. Alex, I'd love your thoughts until we get MacKenzie back of just like, I think you agree with both of what MacKenzie and I are saying, that this is essentially going to be holding back innovation and development.
Yeah, I think it will. States, Bitcoin, individuals, entities that adopt Bitcoin will rise. Entities that do not will fall, basically. Relative to each other. And over long periods, I think there won't be businesses that don't accept Bitcoin, states that don't accept Bitcoin. We've seen this technology only grow. Really, when people, once you grok it, you don't really go back. At least the way Bitcoin currently operates. It's ends up being a net positive for the user, whether they're an institution or an individual, and they don't really go backwards and reject Bitcoin. That's not happening very often.
All right, we have MacKenzie back now.
Hey, sorry.
No, good. We were essentially just continuing the conversation and dialogue. I think we lost you just after asking you to sort of expand on this idea that, we're going to be watching states like Texas continue to bolster and push up Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses, while we're now essentially having the state of New York give Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses the middle finger.
Yeah. Really quickly about Texas, like what's especially interesting there is that you have the use cases for so many different power sources, right? Like you've got on-grid Bitcoin mining. We can go into that in a minute, why that's a good thing, and it's fundamentally misunderstood. You've got renewable powered mining operations in West Texas, where you've the intersection of the wind belt and solar, like where peak solar is in the country. You've got oil and gas majors using natural gas they can't get into a pipeline that they otherwise would flare, being channeled into these Bitcoin mining operations. And it's just like all this microcosm of all the different examples of how this can be hugely beneficial and actually help companies hit ESG targets, thinking about oil and gas companies. So Yes. Do I think that this will shift hash rate elsewhere in the country? Yes. Do I think that Texas will be one of those beneficiaries if this passes in New York? Yes. But I think that the concern is, and why I like every conversation that I have related to the New York legislation is why people who have skin in the game in Texas and not necessarily New York. So why do they care? Like if they're in Texas, they're not in New York, why do they think that this is bad? And they think it's bad because it sets a precedent that will have a domino effect across the country, that will be the first of like more aggressive changes to come. And then what does that mean for the viability of the industry across the US? Like if this then gets, kicked up to a federal mandate. And again, like I said, like the EO from Biden was pretty generous and a lot of people saw it as a win. But then, do we have a separate narrative emerge that's specific to the energy side of this? Where do you want to go next? There's so much we can get into with respect to mining.
I want to get in a moment into the on-grid mining stuff, because I do think that's a very valuable thing for us to really break down so that people can understand and explain, both for them to understand and then explain onwards to the next person. But I want to, there's another side of the coin too, where this domino effect of New York's legislation and every other state sort of seeing it and following suit. But you're also seeing like, I believe it was a senator or a congressperson from South Dakota offering to bring businesses, Bitcoin businesses over to South Dakota. We have Senator Loomis in Wyoming continue to push forward legislation. Do you think that this could turn into almost like in the same way we watch sort of reopening and mask mandates start to make decisions we saw businesses in my home state of California start to jump ship, and the exodus from California to Florida and Texas is very, very real. Do we start to see a similar play out with Bitcoin mining and the laws in place, where you'll have some states that are going to be very freedom focused, very oriented towards helping miners set up and operate, versus more restrictive measures that are going to just prevent Bitcoin businesses from operating in those states?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely the potential for that from the conversations that I'm happening, like a polarizing effect where you see that there are certain states that are more crypto friendly jurisdictions, which is one of the core components of being an ideal destination for a Bitcoin miner. Think back a year ago, it's upwards of 75 to 80% of the network was in China. So that literally, it was so quickly it shifted over to the US, and it came to the US because it was generally for a couple of different reasons. The cost of energy, the fact that there was infrastructure ready to go and just have people plug in their gear or have their new deliveries installed in the US, but also crucially, like number 3 on that list, if not number 1 for other people, is like the how crypto friendly the political jurisdiction is, because that has huge implications, as you just saw play out when China banished all of its Bitcoin miners.
No, absolutely. I mean, to expand on that idea too, is I think the stability of the government and like belief that the government, that jurisdiction at least, is going to be pro Bitcoin or pro cryptocurrency, or just pro what you need it to be, versus on a whim you can see certain regimes just flip the switch. I'm curious your thoughts on just sort of, as we saw yesterday with the Central African Republic now announcing Bitcoin as legal tender, news circulating around Panama, which we will be giving an update during the last hour of our show about what's going on down in Panama. There still seems to be no real substantive conversation to push the ball forward for Bitcoin as far as legal tender, expanding on its sort of use cases or abilities here on a legislative level. I'm curious your conversations, if you've heard anything beyond just sort of the classic rumor mill that's circulating Twitter right now.
Yeah, I mean, so when I think about the conversation in the US with respect to this idea of Bitcoin being used as legal tender, the narrative immediately goes to El Salvador. And obviously there have been a lot of, I haven't personally covered this in the last month or so, but there have been a lot of stories that have come out that have looked at, drop-offs and the Chivo wallet, use of the Chivo wallet, like pointing to some of the vulnerabilities of the rollout and how it's gone 1 year on. And that's more of the narrative that I've seen. But what do you guys think? Like, how do you think the El Salvador experiment is playing out right now?
I think it's playing out the way it's meant to play out. I'm a big believer that, the way Bitcoin is going to be adopted is going to be slow and steady, and then all at once at a time. And that goes on a global scale as well as a localized scale. You'll see slow adopters, and then eventually there's going to be a decision maker who can really make or break how this technology gets expanded on, such as a president of a country seeing the viability of, hey, we don't really have a national currency. We need to figure out some way for our citizens to be able to interact with money that's not beholden to the powers that be. I'm a big proponent and believer that every single country who's essentially been cut out of the US money printing system is going to look to Bitcoin first. And they're going to slowly but surely adopt Bitcoin before all of the Western countries. And then the West is going to be playing catch up. The West has enough wealth that catch up will let them sort of have an equilibrium or still give them some sort of an advantage. But I definitely see more countries like El Salvador and the Central African Republic adopting Bitcoin long before I see any modern westernized countries really do it.
Now, this is not the same thing as adopting it as legal tender, but I was having this really interesting conversation with Alex Gladstein, and he was making the point that, Russia, it had this $630 billion nest egg, but it had its FX reserves weaponized against them, as the West kind of instituted a lot of these sanctions and froze, the currencies that were in that, what was meant to be a war chest to help them stave off the effect of economic blockades. And so the point that he was making was this sort of dictator's dilemma, where you would think that a country like China or Russia would typically be resistant to a currency that they don't control, that is like outside their hands. But it also means that other nation states can't weaponize it against them. And so and so it was this interesting idea that, like, perhaps could they be like the first at it to, be among the major nations to first put it on their balance sheet as a way to almost protect themselves. And then I was thinking this again because last week, the latest round of sanctions that included BitRiver, which is a company that mines for Bitcoin. They have operations across Russia. They're technically headquartered elsewhere. But anyways, the point was made in this in this document from the government there was a fear that Russia could evade sanctions because of the proceeds from Bitcoin mining in the country. And so there is this, and we're not getting into the sanctions debate right now. Like, we don't have to do that because there are so many reasons why that's also been debunked. But the idea of it being a sort of protectant against currency being weaponized against them is interesting. And I just thought of it when you were talking about adoption at the national scale.
Yeah, I think you'll first see nations come to Bitcoin who need a problem solved. Like, they come to Bitcoin with a defensive strategy in mind. They don't have control of their own currency. They don't control the mint. They're not close to the money printer, so they're not quintillionaires. So I think you'll see them come first, and you'll see the West's response at first being like hemming and hawing, trying to squash Bitcoin, and then realizing they can't. And as Q said, then finally adopting it to compete. The funny thing about that is I think they'll absolutely be penalized in terms of price appreciation, and they're not going to be able to stack thousands of Bitcoins the way, Sailor or an El Salvador has at all, right? Anyone who's been in Bitcoin for a couple of years knows, your first 10 Bitcoins easy going, next 10 not so, or 100 depending on the period you got in, or even nowadays people are struggling to get to a single Bitcoin. So that proof of work really is going to penalize laggards on a nation state level.
So what do you say, when you are trying to debunk or respond to somebody who says, hey, Bitcoin can never be the world's reserve currency because there are only ever going to be 21 million coins. What happens when you go into a recession? And I get the whole point is that you're not printing money. And that's a great thing because you're not going to deal with the inflation that can come with that. But what do you say to naysayers about Bitcoin becoming the world's reserve currency?
I think they don't understand scarcity because we've never encountered anything like it in the world. Like, gold has a perceived scarcity that's not absolute. There's more gold than we would ever know what to do with. The fact is, we've only scratched the surface of the earth, literally, in searching for 0.000 1% of the gold out there. But that's very tightly controlled, right? So that gives you a feel for what hard money should be. But in terms of reserve currency, what you want is a store of value and something that can operate also as a medium of exchange and unit of account. And I think Bitcoin has more than proven itself as a great store of value. That absolute scarcity brings the conservation of energy into the digital realm where it wasn't before, and you're going to see all these wonderful new use cases emerge. And chief among them being people actually being able to build things on a hard money standard. I think like as a society, we've kind of stalled in all areas, and we're just kind of shuffling things around here in terms of academia. You see this in science, technology. There's not much happening. I mean, you could take the optimistic side of that coin, but compared to the innovations that came out of something like the Renaissance, where we were as a society on a hard money standard, I mean, what we're living in now is just kind of just a mess of central planning. And I think Bitcoin is like the one route out of that. Sorry, that's a pretty long-winded answer to your question.
I think
no, it's helpful.
To add to that too, and my base case argument always goes back to this idea that in all of our lifetimes, all of us having this conversation right now, we have only ever known both the US dollar as the global reserve currency and no sort of gold standard. However, if you go back historically speaking, we've changed what the global reserve currency was based on what the world power was at the time. And also, we have historically done this mistake over and over and over again and seem to have never learned the mistake of removing ourselves from a gold standard or having some sort of a hard money backing a fiat currency. You can go as far back as to the Renaissance days when the first and earliest banks were really formed, and they took a gold standard fiat currency off of the gold standard, and it was almost cyclical within an estimated 50-year cycle. Every single time this has happened historically, we end up seeing mass inflation, and the final catalyst to really kill the fiat currency is price control. Every single time this has happened historically, those have been the catalysts that led to that fiat currency that was the global reserve currency of the time being eliminated and a new system having to be formed. We're just unfortunately alive and witnessing that happen in real time. I highly recommend Eric Yates' book, The Seventh Property. He does a fantastic job of really explaining the history of banking a lot more than some of these other Bitcoin books explain the history of money. And that history of banking really paints this picture of these 50-year cycles where fiat currencies tend to die, and the final catalyst to kill them is a price control from the government.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add to that real quick, Q. I think like a great answer to the question you asked previously, MacKenzie, is people don't understand what money is. They don't fully appreciate it. And that's not a slight. I was definitely there too. I think most like pre-Bitcoiners are. They don't understand that there's a distinction between fiat money and money that's chosen by the people. And we were raised believing, and have been for generations, that money is issued by the state. And what we really need is to sever money and state, because the state has proven day after day that they are not responsible, and the incentives will never align to make them responsible and to act appropriately when in control of a money printer. So what you do is you separate money from state, and you return money to its in fact truer definition, which is something like Bitcoin, which is not issued by a centralized entity and can't be printed arbitrarily or debased. And then you get closer to a hard money standard, and everyone reaps the benefits of that.
Does the US government realistically let that happen in the next 20 years? And if they don't, do you guys leave the US? Like, how strongly do you feel about being based where you are versus going elsewhere to more, friendly government?
If I could genuinely figure out an easier way to travel my girlfriend's dog around the country and world, I would not be in Los Angeles. But I am of the minority who doesn't think in my lifetime the US dollar necessarily goes away. I definitely think that when I'm old and gray, like there'll still be some sort of a dollar transaction, but what the dollar is backed off of will look drastically different. But that's just my opinion and speculation.
Yeah, I think in our lifetime it's gonna get pretty hairy here. It's gonna get pretty scary. We're gonna see these central bank surveillance coins, as I like to call them, issued out by the US government. We're gonna see the US dollar as we know it probably fail. Although it is the strongest of the government issued currencies, we've seen them kick the can down the road for like over 100 years, and they might continue doing so. But I think more and more people are realizing this is not a store of value. This taxation is a theft of my time. This inflation is the most subversive theft of my time and energy, right? If you just worked at your job day after day, blue collar, whatever, you work at a grocery store, if you didn't get like a 20% raise, you got a pay cut this year. People are starting to realize that. This is the beauty of the internet and decentralization.
Yeah, Marty Bent had this like great post a couple of weeks ago, and he basically it was in the context of what the weekend after the country of Lebanon declared bankruptcy. Essentially, people lost their life savings overnight. Like if your savings, which for a lot of people it was denominated in the local currency, that went away. And what Marty was saying is that anyone who is, and this is his opinion and a widely held opinion, but if anyone stores their life savings in any sort of fiat currency over a long enough time horizon, it'll be a similar narrative to what we just saw happen in Lebanon. And it is an interesting idea, this erosion of personal wealth. You perhaps you don't feel it on a day-to-day basis, but certainly over the course of time, like we're just seeing it happen in a very protracted, in a very small timeline in countries like Lebanon.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question, like if you're asking me personally, how strongly do I feel about it? Very, very, very strongly. These principles are like first and foremost to me. If the United States banned Bitcoin or somehow made it, that doesn't affect the protocol fundamentally. I could still transact peer-to-peer. I could still buy goods and services from Chris or Q or even you with Bitcoin, no issue. But I'm absolutely going to vote with my feet and live in the most friendly place for Bitcoiners to live. There's a variety of those places now, but right now it's not so bad in the U.S. You can buy goods and services with Bitcoin. It's great. It's deemed as a property. It's going very well, I would say. I just think it's going to get very, very dicey when people start to realize that they've been screwed by the government in terms of their money, and they need a exit hatch, and they're all going to come to Bitcoin. And I think a lot of them actually, let me correct that, won't come to Bitcoin first. You see what happened in Lebanon. People did not flock to Bitcoin. Some people did, but they run to other stable coins. They try to get closer to the dollar. They try to get closer to any stronger currency, but hopefully with the new, stable coins on top of Lightning, something like that, they can at least have the security of Bitcoin in the future. And they won't have to tolerate its relative volatility. If they can't, they can swap in and out of whatever stable currency they want.
Yeah, two thoughts on what you just said. The first was like that point about the resiliency of the network, and that is the conversation in the context of what might happen with New York, what happened with China last year. Like obviously a nation state stamping out its crypto mining industry, its Bitcoin mining industry doesn't affect the network. Like it kind of moves on without skipping a beat. But you also brought up the point that you can still transact in it. You like switch over to peer-to-peer networks, and so you do it in a different way. And you've seen that play out in Nigeria. Like the government, when they chose to ban crypto mining, or not crypto mining, sorry, when they really went aggressively against like crypto in general, I believe it was last year around this time. It was at a point at which in the country adoption was already so huge and so prevalent that it just kind of drove the industry underground instead. And so the peer-to-peer exchanges are still, if anything, they've gone tremendously up. And so it's one of those examples where you do see this idea of resiliency plays out. And then your later point about, people like typically go to stable coins first, like that's something else that's come up, that like Tether was quite huge in Ukraine as people were, looking to use that instead of necessarily having Bitcoin be their first port of call. Yeah, just my 2 cents on those 2 points.
I want to also just sort of present this question back to you, MacKenzie. I mean, we have in this country now, like I'll call it since about 2016, we've been seeing a divisive nature and a lack of trust between citizens and the government and just central planning in general. We saw it really take shape during the pandemic, and you see a lot of people are just frustrated and sick of the government, who seems to be on their own little castle, doing their own little thing.
the rules don't apply to them. And meanwhile, they dictate to everyone else what to do. And then to couple that, we're now starting to feel the effects, monetarily speaking, where you go to the grocery store now and eggs are $1 more, $1.25 more for a dozen eggs. You're seeing the price of milk start to go up. Like, you're having a harder time putting food on the table for your family. Meanwhile, Congress is getting another raise this year. Meanwhile, you're seeing like a lack or a disconnect from our political leaders and the actual citizens. And I think that's helping to feed into some people going in and adopting Bitcoin. Other people are looking elsewhere, but finding sort of that thing to align with that takes them away from aligning with the government. I'm curious your thoughts on just this idea that Bitcoin is one of those things that people can start to align with separate from the government here, domestically speaking.
Yeah, I over the past year, basically since I've been on this beat as since I joined the technology team at CNBC, I've been at CNBC for longer, but since I've been in this dedicated role, I've lived in a couple different places. So I was in San Francisco, but I spent a lot of time in Texas last year, specifically because of it's a fascinating place with respect to the mining industry, but also with respect to like the Bitcoin contingent who lives in Austin and other parts of the country. I spent some time in Houston and all over the place. And I just bring this up because it's a much different mindset in Texas than it is in California, than it is in DC, than it is in New York, which is where I also spent time last year. So I was kind of like all over the political spectrum, so to speak, like across the country. And the sentiment that really comes up again and again among the people that I spoke to in Austin and Houston, and I would spend a little bit of time in Dallas too, is this idea of, and it aligns with like the narrative with respect to COVID restrictions as well, is this idea of political freedom and having that ability to have independence from the state and to make decisions that aren't being dictated so closely with respect to personal choices medically or with respect to your finances. So the kind of hands-off approach of the state is hugely welcomed by a lot of the folks that I spoke to there. But I don't know, does that answer your question? Maybe it's just like an observation that I've had, because like obviously the Texas mindset is much different to San Francisco, which is different to DC, to New York, et cetera.
I can speak to the LA mindset where everyone, like, the moment they started saying, oh, let's wear masks again, I literally threw a fit and said, absolutely not. I would rather just drive myself everywhere and not drink than have to go back into an Uber with a mask. But that's just like, I'm definitely in the minority here, unfortunately. But like, there is this push of libertarianism within the Bitcoin ecosystem because it essentially feeds into that idea. My last sort of question on this topic before we really dive in to just mining in general. I know we don't have a ton of time left with you, but what is, I think, in your opinion, what is the worst case scenario of what the government, US government, can do specifically towards Bitcoin legislative wise?
I think that a lot of people felt that the worst case scenario was avoided in this latest executive order, which was, and I know I've said this a couple of times, which was largely pretty positive. And I think the worst mistake you can make is try to take an approach like the government of Nigeria has, like just to ban an entire industry, which is so firmly a part of the financial system now. Like every major bank on Wall Street has their, and I feel bad saying the word crypto now on this on this talk after I know that we're focusing on Bitcoin, but like, every bank has like, a crypto desk. And so it's, and that's just like one bellwether, like one indication of how this is very much here to stay. So I think the worst case scenario would be just to try to, totally ban an asset class, because it just doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't, it's about understanding how to, create rules and regulations that make sense. And like so many of the companies in this space have said that they welcome that kind of rulemaking instead of, retroactive decisions that would be made about things that are happening now. So I think that the landscape is open to it, happy for it. I think it will be interesting. Like this was something that you guys brought up a little bit ago, but how does a CBDC in the US play out? Like obviously the EU1 is much farther along, and there has been conversations about this idea of, I was talking to Andrew Yang about the idea of a CBDC, and some of the benefits are like, let's say you want to give stimulus money, but there are certain, rules that you apply to that cash, and you have to spend it within a couple of weeks. You can only spend it at like smaller businesses. Like those are interesting characteristics that might be possible through a centrally distributed form of cash. But then what you guys were talking about earlier is also there's a new level of surveillance that's introduced if you're now using a central, like a currency that's issued by a central bank. And so it opens a can of worms with respect to what does that mean? What are the implications of that? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
My big takeaway from that was the fact that I think we've taught MacKenzie that Bitcoin and crypto are separate, and hopefully this starts to infiltrate the rest of the CNBC ranks.
No, I knew that before, right? I knew that before.
Fair. I want to now go over though and focus on the rest of our conversation on mining. And I want to start with a question that we got from one of our commenters, specifically just on the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. We're seeing a lot of conversation right now go on in the EU pushing forward, probably working with Vitalik. Okay, yes, that's me just wearing my tinfoil hat saying that. But we are seeing a big push around proof of stake. I'm curious your thoughts, what you're seeing both domestically and conversations elsewhere about why we as Bitcoiners really want to stick to the proof of work, and why legislators, for whatever reason, have this idea that proof of stake is better.
Yeah, it's because it becomes this binary choice between what takes less energy, and there's less thought about what it means for the decentralization of a network. Now, obviously, since 2014, Ethereum has been talking about this migration from proof of work to proof of stake, and it looks like it will happen Q3, but we'll see how they go. But the bottom line is that people immediately make a couple of assumptions, right? So one, that energy consumption is the same thing as your carbon footprint. They're not. Like, you have to look at your energy inputs. So there's like the energy side of it, like just understanding that, like, energy consumption versus carbon footprint, that's one. And then two, realizing that like proof of stake versus proof of work is not just an automatic, like one is a winner with respect to ESG and one is a loser. Because again, it's just like it's a more nuanced conversation. And then understanding the trade-off also of having a more decentralized network. Now I'm gonna let someone on this panel, like, I can give you my definition of proof of stake, but I think I'm going to butcher it compared to one of the experts. So can somebody just like quickly like lay it out, like explaining how like kind of your stake of the currency determines how much say you have in terms of securing a blockchain?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, your stake is proportional to your kind of control over some aspect of how the currency is used, or like what rules are followed. So Bitcoin is proof of work to take the thing out of the hands of people, right? This is what's so great about it. So you can't simply change Bitcoin to proof of work, as we know. That's just not how it has no value proposition without proof of work. Proof of work is the very thing that introduces, true decentralization, digital scarcity, conservation of energy into cyberspace. Like, this is the genius of this invention, is proof of work. Whereas proof of stake, all these other cryptocurrencies are functionally not too much different from what we have now, which is a proof of stake system, where those who are closest to the money printer control, or who develop the rules around the monetary supply and issuance, tend to benefit more because they have a greater stake in the game. So that's like a completely unfair system. This is why you see wild wealth distribution in the United States and other countries. I don't know if Q or Chris had a definition there that they wanted to.
I mean, I think you kind of hit the head on the nail. I'd never say that right, I don't think. Just this idea that, if we were to be on proof of stake here on Bitcoin, like someone like Michael Saylor or some of these OG whales can just sort of dictate and decide out how the network is now going to operate. So you almost reintroduce this issue of the richest people having the most influence over society, protocol, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and you look at these cryptos, they all have like 60% pre-mines. So that's a 60% stake. That means they dictate the rules of the currency. That means they can rug pull you. They can disenfranchise you by changing the rules, and you're not interested in the new rules, so you don't upgrade and you lose all your wealth. That doesn't happen in Bitcoin. And this proof of work, this energy expenditure that mainstream media has painted Bitcoin as somehow evil and like demonized us for is totally backwards and absurd. Like, you've got people advocating for society to go back to run on the same technology that like we were running on in like the 1800s, like water wheels. Energy expenditure is a measure of how progressive like a society is, and we should be expending greater and greater amounts of energy and harnessing greater and greater resources without ruining our planet. So like the two things I would say to kind of break up that misunderstanding are: energy expenditure is not inherently bad, right? That's just a fact. And secondly, like, Bitcoin incentivizes renewable, cheap forms of energy. It's not this great coal guzzling technology, and it won't always be using coal. They're incentivized, miners are incentivized to seek out remote sources of energy, hydro, nuclear, solar, wind, what have you. But just look at the state of the green energy lobby, and how many cities have they powered with their solar energy and wind? They're just not viable solutions to these problems. Nuclear is, but we refuse to tolerate it for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what you're saying about renewable, there's just not the financial incentive in a lot of places in remote West Texas where you don't have the infrastructure built to even put it on the grid. And so now you've got Bitcoin miners that are location agnostic, who you can drive up a trailer of thousands of Bitcoin miners. You create a financial incentive to build out the infrastructure to, harness that power while you build a grid infrastructure to get it out there to actually put it on the grid. And then the other thing that I think that is fundamentally misunderstood is that adding extra demand, a certain kind of extra demand to a power grid can be a good thing. And what the power demand that Bitcoin miners add is something that is very flexible. It's a controllable load resource, which just means that you can toggle your demand up and down to meet the needs of the grid. And the reason that kind of like very flexible baseline energy consumer is important is because it balances out these inherently volatile power sources like solar and wind. Because when you add that onto a grid, it's not automatically a good thing. Because you need to be able to balance it out when it's not windy or when it's not sunny. And if you don't have that base load, which a Bitcoin mine can be, then you got problems. And that's something that I think that I think there is a gap in understanding there.
Yeah, and there's been a totally misdirected sort of narrative around this. I think these kind of like weird narratives that emerge and these entire businesses that are built around kind of like government subsidies, I think they just happen by accident. It's just like a weird blip. It's like just the strange outcome of the simulation of all the cumulative algorithms that we have, that you get something like a Tesla, right? That would probably be like the champion of like the green energy crowd. This is just a great virtue signal. Tesla still needs to burn, like at bottom, you still have to burn coal to get this thing powered. I mean, some people can pull energy from their house to supplement it a little bit, but you're just outsourcing the engine from the car to a power plant 100 miles away, which is probably good in terms of like getting pollutants out of localized areas, right? That's like a step in the right direction. But I think it's important that we're honest about what these technologies are actually bringing. And it's time to reevaluate our grids in general. And I think Bitcoin is the future of energy production.
MacKenzie, I'm also curious, like ESG has become this sort of hot button issue within the investing space for a few years now, but really picked up steam over the course of the last two in particular. And it almost feels like a lot of the ESG narrative, to Alex's point, like Tesla made more money before it started to actually make cars, and those cars made them money last year. All of its profits were coming from carbon credits that fell under this sort of ESG bucket. Like the ESG narrative seems to
fit and help some companies, while then it goes and attacks other very viable forms of business or technology, one of those being Bitcoin. I'm curious your thoughts on how this balancing act is playing out both in the broader tech space and then specifically with Bitcoin and crypto. Oh, not again. I guess this might be a lesson that CNBC's internet access isn't as good as they tell you.
Okay, back.
There we're at.
Yay.
Yeah, no, clearly it's not as good as they tell you. I can still hear you.
You heard that.
I'm plugged in
Okay.
with an Ethernet cord in the flash cam. Wait, let me show you. Oh, I can't move this around to show you where I am. Sorry. So, okay, to answer your question, we're going to start with the back half of it. When I think of ESG in the context of Bitcoin, my mind just immediately goes to the oil and gas companies that have these super aggressive like ESG targets, like getting rid of flaring natural gas. And what's interesting to me is that finally this year we're seeing like these major publicly traded companies. Some choosing to go public, like ConocoPhillips did, and then Exxon has been working with Crusoe Energy up in the Bakken in North Dakota to do just that. And I think there's been this general concern that being associated, general concern among oil and gas majors that being associated with Bitcoin mining would be terrible for their ESG narrative, or like it would spook shareholders. And if anything, on the days that I wrote both of those stories, like the stock didn't do anything. Like I think that it's helped to normalize this idea. And I think that people are starting to understand like, oh yeah, this is like a really useful way to avoid having to flare gas and in a worst case scenario, vent gas. So I think that idea is being normalized, and it's actually I think there's been a lot of education in recent months. Like obviously I'm not the only person who's writing about this, around this idea of like the aggressive oil and gas ESG targets. Bitcoin miners can be a part of helping them reach and attain those goals. So that's been very interesting to me. Now the whole kind of going back to what we were talking about with New York lawmakers considering banning new Bitcoin mining operations, certain proof of work mining operations. Now, what is interesting there is that they're kind of pointing to this it's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which mandates that New York's greenhouse gas emissions be cut by 85% by 2050. And so that is where this is getting momentum from. But again, like I said, I was talking to Perianne Boring, and she was one who was making the point that this stamping out this industry is kind of counter to achieving those goals because of the sustainable mix that is powering the Bitcoin mining industry in New York State specifically. And so again, it's not like it's not this like binary choice. And again, I think it is being misunderstood. So, and I mean, like that doesn't go to your entire question because you're asking about general trends in the tech industry, about ESG. I put that back to you because I focus so much of my attention. I focus just on, crypto and Bitcoin in particular. But how do you think things have been going in the last 6 months with respect to that narrative?
Complete and utter bullshit just used by certain companies to have an advantageous sticker on their sort of earnings report at the end of each quarter versus like actually helping either economically or socially or having like a genuine positive impact to their society is too broad of a word, but their local communities, if you will. I just think it's it's a gold sticker for adults. That's my opinion on it, quite frankly. But I'm curious more so now on what you're seeing with it on the Bitcoin side of things and how it's being almost used against some of these Bitcoin companies, especially mining companies in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the biggest critique. And it goes to what we've said before, like energy consumption is not the same thing as what your carbon footprint is. If a lot of your inputs are green, then, this is not a bad thing. And you're making the point, Alex, that like it's not necessarily a bad thing. If anything, it's a good thing if you kind of, expand energy use. It's just about, so that's one part of it. But also like Amanda Fabiano, I was talking to her like, the conference in Miami a couple of weeks ago on a mining panel that we had. And she made the point that like, you also have to believe that like this energy input is being put toward a good thing. Like it's being put toward a monetary network that has a lot of pluses. So you also have to like have buy-in into that. And like, we can of course like run through the laundry list of things of like what consumes more power than this network. So then I mean, in part, this is ideological, of course, like you have to believe that there's a greater service, and there are so many interesting use cases. And one thing that I know we don't have time to talk about today, but like, I've been spending so much more time thinking about the Lightning Network and talking to Jack Mallers, Elizabeth Stark. Like there are just so many fascinating things that are happening with respect to layer 2 payment technologies that, I mean, it's disrupting legacy banking systems that have been in place since the 1940s. And that's so interesting to me.
MacKenzie, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that we're coming up on the hour. I'm just telling you right now on the spot, you're going to get emails from me to come back onto the show so we can continue this conversation, because this was too much fun. It's good to know that there's someone in mainstream media who gets it and can hopefully be orange pilling the rest of your colleagues and beyond that. Where can our audience find more about you, stay up to date with your latest articles and research?
Yeah, it was great joining you guys, and I would love to come back. And in terms of following my reporting on Twitter, I'm at Kenzie Sigalos, and CNBC.com/my name, MacKenzie Sigalos. So that's got all my stories. And we have a daily, digital crypto show called Crypto World, and we have a lot of different coverage. So it's not all Bitcoin, but like I'd love to get your voices and perspectives on there. And I'm like, my DMs are open on Twitter. Like, please hit me up if you have like thoughts or ideas or things that haven't been covered that you think should be. I really welcome input.
Yeah, we love it. We'll drop some of your links in the chat, MacKenzie, and let's get some Bitcoin to our listeners on behalf of this awesome interview, please, Chris. You guys sorry, I was gonna say CNBC should implement that on your morning crypto show. Drop some free Bitcoin for your listeners.
We will connect you. We will genuinely connect you with the Carrot app team, and they will gift you guys Bitcoin to do that if that's something you want.
I don't know if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, probably not, right?
Too many laws and regulations.
Thanks, guys, for the chat. Really interesting, and let's talk more about Lightning the next time. I'll have done more on it by then.
I love it. We'll be back after a quick commercial break, and we're going to break a breaking story about the news going on down in Panama. So stick around, guys, and we'll be discussing all the exciting stuff down there. What is up? We are back. And it is news, and we're going to call it noise going forward with myself, Alex, and Chris. One huge story. We're going to try to really dissect and break this down. I'm going to stop staring at you guys because I'm going to have to be reading off my laptop a bunch. But it's Panama. Panama announced earlier today that off of their third round of debates, they have pushed forward legislation to essentially make and introduce crypto at large, including Bitcoin, legal tender. And this will include the opportunity to have citizens pay their taxes in Bitcoin. There will be no capital gains tax. And what is, I think, the most surprising thing out of this news is not the news itself, but in the way that Panama's parliament works. There are 3 rounds of debates. And after each round, essentially Congress will vote. And after round 3, which we just had today, if it's a yes vote, it goes to the president to sign into law. It was unanimously voted by Congress to get pushed forward and presented to the president. And the president now has 30 days to sign this into law, essentially making Bitcoin and crypto at large legal tender. Initial reactions from you, Alex.
I guess they'd be similar to my reactions for all the adoption. Let's wait and see how it goes. I'm excited. We knew this would come. I think, I don't know, man, the El Salvador energy kind of went flat with me maybe about 6 to 8 months ago, a little bit. I think we expected a lot more countries to get in a lot sooner. Now I've accepted that they're not coming, and then here they come. So I've got to kind of get back on the beat of nation states adopting Bitcoin. So I don't have anything prepared on this really for you.
No, and this is going to be a little bit of an off the cuff kind of conversation, guys. Bear with us because genuinely this news broke, I think, 10 minutes before we went live. And during this entire conversation, both with MacKenzie and then with Aaron and Pete, I was like listening into our watching our Slack channel and asking our head of news to like, hey, keep sending these updates on this channel because we're gonna have to talk about this. We can't not. I think it's very interesting to see this news coming off of the news about CAR, the Central African Republic. I wouldn't be surprised if this starts to get the ball rolling with yet another country now pushing forward legislation. Chris, I'd love your thoughts as well on just this breaking news out of Panama.
I got to take the contrarian opinion, I think. I think it's even called like blockchain, at the act of blockchain or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe right when El Salvador was making Bitcoin legal tender, they kind of had a mock drill drafted up probably back in like August or September. Not that they were racing to beat El Salvador. Obviously, El Salvador kind of had more of the rails in place to do so, but they had a bill that came out, I believe it was Panama, and it was not favorable. I mean, I have not had a chance, like you mentioned, this came out 10 minutes before we went live and we were just talking on the high level topics. It looks like Bitcoin's legal tender and there are no cap gains. That wasn't the case when they were trying to implement it back in September or August of last year, at least the draft bill proposal. It was much more stringent and harsher in terms of cap gains, in terms of use case, in terms of surveillance. So I need a chance to fully read it and dive into it. I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, I don't know other countries' elections, but maybe it coincides partly with midterm elections in the United States, or I don't know. Like I said, I don't know Panama's election schedule, but Q and Alex and I have been kind of hammering home this point. Politicians are grifters, and maybe the politicians are bandwagoning behind trying to get this to be good PR for their country, for people to come there, for, we've been locked down for 2 years. What's the best way to try and incentivize travelers from abroad, whether it's Americans or other places that have money? Everyone's talking about Bitcoin and how many people have gotten wealthy. I think this is a way to try and attract travelers that have like hampered economies for the last 2 years because of everything that everyone's been through. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm need to do more research on it, but I'm like I said, cautiously optimistic. I'm not going to say it's a good thing or a bad thing just yet.
Yeah, I would. I'd point out with that. I mean, the regulation could be anything, might not be friendly, but the difference between other nations and El Salvador is people got to remember that El Salvador adopting Bitcoin was not a top-down decision. This was something that was proposed by the people of El Salvador. This started first with a circular economy on Bitcoin Beach and was brought to the president's attention because it was successful, and they made a decision there to embrace it rather than reject it out of hand and squash this movement. So that's kind of like a much more organic origin story than these other countries that are kind of wishy-washy in terms of like Bitcoin regulation, and it always comes with like kind of like crypto regulation. So I mean, I think we got to see first a recognition by the population of a small country, a recognition of Bitcoin's use case, which is taking, giving themselves not only bank accounts, but sovereign property that's not being debased by their local or a foreign government. So I think there's a lot of ifs in there. And I think it's going to take longer than some of us would have hoped for really to watch the game theory start spreading out. But yeah, I do think the dominoes are falling, so to speak.
A couple of quick facts just to throw both of your guys' ways. To Chris's point, they actually have to specifically in this new bill earmark Bitcoin to reverse the bill that you are talking about where they made Bitcoin illegal in Panama. So they literally have to make an addendum to this new legislation to overturn past legislation. So let this be a reminder. Just because they're passing it today, they could literally change their mind with the next sort of government power that's anti-Bitcoin, and they'll take the powers away. So that is 100% still on the table. Couple more facts to throw your way. Over 50% of Panama citizens are unbanked. So this continues to feed the narrative that Bitcoin can help and will help unbanked and underserved populations across the world, but specifically in regions that adopt Bitcoin first and quicker. I think, Chris, there's something I agree with and also disagree with on the notion that politicians are grifter in this example. I hate politicians. Every single Bitcoin politician is full of shit, especially here in the US. You heard me fucking say it, and I'll say it again. All of these guys are just grifting for your votes, and gals. They're all grifting for your votes. They don't give a damn about Bitcoin. Plain and simple. Here in America, I said it. Come at me, any of you politicians.
Nick's hopping in the room, just giving you a heads up. So
perfect. So we're about to be joined now by Nick Hoffman, the head of our social efforts. He's been really on the ground floor.
Let's go.
Learning about this. The second point I want to touch on, though, and Nick can speak to this more, like the idea that you have all 40 of these Congress people unanimously voted for this. I don't think this is a grift in that sense. I do, however, think this could be a PR stunt in the same lens of, hey, we've been getting wrecked by COVID. We need to boost tourism in some way, shape, or form. Holy shit. The Central African Republic is getting so much press, noise, and everything. Like, I want to be the center of attention. What can we do to push Bitcoin forward? But I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let the guy who's actually been really following this story as it's been breaking, Nick, really give us the details of what's been going on down in Panama.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you guys have been discussing so far today, but from what I've learned, I was in the spaces earlier today with the Congressman Gabriel Silva, and he was discussing it a bit. As long as someone else who's not in politics there, but he is close to the congressman. And where do I even start? So let me get my notes here real quick. I apologize.
No problem, Nick. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So one of the things that a lot of people might not know is that Panama doesn't have a central bank. So and one of the laws they were talking about that I find really interesting is because of the Constitution of Panama, they cannot have a legal tender. Like, nothing can be legal tender there. That's what they were saying. So this law has to be like, it can't be like El Salvador's where they say, okay, only BTC, only Bitcoin is legal tender. What they're doing is they're like selecting a select few. They didn't say how much, but they're going to select a certain amount of cryptos and then Bitcoin. And then they're going to have their citizens choose, okay, if you want to do commerce, if you want to do commerce in this, you can do, you can spend this and do business stuff with this. Before doing a business, like doing a Bitcoin business there had a lot of implications. Some of it was actually illegal. So what they're doing is they're now having a a new license there, and this license has very low barrier to entry. And then what they want to do is they really want to attract all this new competition. So they're also giving them a lot of like incentives as well to move there. There is 0% capital gains tax there, but something that we're in talks with the congressman now. We're trying to clarify is there is 0% capital gains tax, which means if you were to spend it, typically under normal legal tender laws, there's no taxes. But he was saying how there was a tax and it's a new tax. So we're trying to clarify what that new tax is for when you spend it. But since Bitcoin is like a foreign currency, it would not be subject to any taxes, if you were to sell it. If you were to buy low and then sell high, there would be no taxes on that. I'm trying to think what else. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me.
Can you talk a little bit? I know you guys were touching on just sort of, they have to have this clause in there about Bitcoin specifically because of their previous legislation banning Bitcoin. Did they break that down any further for you?
Specifically to what? I'm sorry.
To Bitcoin in particular, because they passed that legislation, I believe last year, making Bitcoin illegal in Panama.
I'm not aware of that. To my knowledge, this bill, it was really heavily Bitcoin focused, but the congressman was saying that because of the law from the Constitution there saying that like no one thing can be legal tender, they couldn't just say Bitcoin outright. They had to include all of crypto. And they're really going to encourage people to use whatever they see fit. But when it does come to spending your Bitcoin, out and about in your daily lives, like obviously like walking into a store and trying to pay in like, some shit coin that's like ranked 18,000 on coin market cap, like, the merchant might not be able to accept that for whatever reason. So they are going to choose like a select amount of cryptos and say like, okay, you can use these for commerce, and then allow the citizens to choose what they want.
Did you get any clarity on, or maybe you essentially provided it, for tax purposes, can citizens pay in any crypto, or is it Bitcoin specific?
So to my knowledge, it would be one of like the select few that they choose. They haven't chosen it yet, but when they do, it'd be one of the select few, but definitely Bitcoin, they said.
And was there anything that stood out from just either the congressman or any of the other commenters down in Panama that might be different in general from El Salvador, other than just the legal tender loophole based on their constitution?
Sorry, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the main differences was that in El Salvador, it was kind of more like a top-down approach. Like Nayib Bukele rushed this bill through, got it signed into law. Like whether, people wanted it or not, it happened. But for this, the really interesting thing was it was unanimously voted on, and it passed with 40 for the bill and 0 against the bill. So everyone wanted this bill happening. And I think that's the major key difference between the El Salvador bill and this bill. Well, one of the major key differences. There are some other key differences like outside the legal tender stuff.
And maybe this is just, as we continue to report on this story, both on this show and through your efforts with the news team, we'll uncover some of these facts. But like, we already established that more than 50% of Panama citizens are unbanked. Do we have a sense of how many Panama citizens are Bitcoin users or holders of Bitcoin currently?
I do not know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
This is what happens when you report on a story live as it breaks. There is
can
no
only
pressure.
imagine.
Pressure on all of you in the audience and everyone listening to make sure you are both following the Bitcoin Magazine Twitter handle, which I don't know why you're not if you're watching this show. And also make sure you're following Nick Can't Mine on Twitter as he continues to send updates about this story. Nick, is there anything else you wanted to touch on about this or anything else about just the going on in Panama as far as of now?
Yeah, just one more thing. So the bill has not been fully signed into law yet. It now goes to the president's desk, and the president now has 30 days to either sign it or veto it. And if he vetoes it, it goes back to where it came from for so they can make changes and amendments to it. But with it passing with 44 and 0 against, I can only assume that the president would sign it and not veto it. So hi.
Have you had any words from him or no? Just the congressman?
Just the congressman. No words from the president yet that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Chris, Nick, while I have you here, I'd love maybe an update or any new news out of the Central African Republic. I know Alex Gladstein was hosting a spaces just about an hour ago, talking with some citizens out there. Is there any updates from that part of the world in regards to their new law?
Well, it's been hard to get some information out of them because I believe they're the 7th poorest nation in the world. And a lot of their country does not have internet access, and it's been really difficult to see or hear the perspectives from people who live there, or even get onto their government website or find their government website, find their officials on social media. I found their Twitter page, their Facebook page, and that's where the president really announced the news the other day. And then he most recently just got onto Twitter, and his Twitter account's now blowing up pretty well. So it's been very difficult to find information for them. But one of the beautiful things about it is this country has probably never had as much, recognition as it has now, because now everyone's eyes are on this country saying, who are they? And, trying to figure out more about them. So hopefully it's just up from here for them.
Definitely we'll have to keep an eye on both of these stories as they continue to develop. You heard that right, though. There are now 3 countries in the world that are viewing Bitcoin as a currency, officially or unofficially, with one of them. And hopefully we will add Panama to that list should their president sign this into law. Nick, thank you so much for at the last second just joining us on this. Make sure you guys give Nick Can't Mine a follow on Twitter, guys.
Thanks for having me. Peace, guys.
Catch you later, Nick.
That is the big news story, or the big 2. I do also want to touch on, I think there was another one this morning.
I've got a story real quick.
Please.
We're hiring 2 video editors. Please apply. You can go to my Twitter. It's McShane_writes, or go to Bitcoin Magazine's Twitter and scroll around a little bit. You should find a link to the application. You can find it on bitcoinerjobs.com. Go to Bitcoin Inc. or Bitcoin Magazine or something, and you'll find the video production /editor posting. Looking for 2 outstanding video editors with industry experience. Maybe you're watching on Twitch or Rumble or YouTube. We want you to come apply, come talk to us, come potentially join the team. We've got a nice little squad here that there's about 3 or 4 other people on, and that team is growing. So this would be a remote full-time position, which includes benefits, opportunity to get a quarterly bonus paid in Bitcoin, opportunity to get paid in Bitcoin outright. Obviously, you'll work closely with the conference. You will be expected to be at the conference. You'll have a hand in many great things at the Bitcoin Inc. organization.
A lot. So if you're watching this show and you actually know how to edit videos, apply. Seriously.
Yeah.
That's the best.
If you want to hang out with us, apply. If you don't want to hang out with us, don't apply. That's
you're
that's the
you're gonna see
test.
us a lot more.
If you want to get out of your fiat job, apply. If you want to stay, if you want to keep getting paid in cuck bucks, don't apply. All right, what do we got, Q?
Oh, that's right. I'm supposed to be looking at more news stories. I mean, to be honest, this took up our entire news ag channel. So I'm not seeing anything other than just a couple of memes that will be dropping later this week. Someone sold an NFT backed home. All right, I have some research and reading to do. Chris, any news stories for news and notes?
No, I'm all good on my end. Alex, I'll send it over to you, and then we can maybe wrap if you got nothing else with Q.
Yeah, let me pull something up. I think it's important to do this every now and then. The price of Bitcoin is 40,000. The sats per dollar, for $1 you get 2,489 satoshis. That's like smaller units of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, if you did not know, is divisible. It can be broken up into 100 million small units called satoshis. Our market cap is sitting at $664 billion. So a little under that $1 trillion market cap threshold, but we'll get there. We'll reclaim it. Yeah, and that's the kind of Clark Moody dashboard update for the day. We're sitting at, where are we at? Block height 733,987. Outside of that, I would say get 10% off anything in the store with promo code FOMO, including your copy of Bitcoin Magazine or your subscription. What else you got, Q?
I found the news story that I knew there was a second one. It's definitely getting buried. I know that we released the embargo, so I feel comfortable saying this now. Refill making a big announcement saying that U.S. users will now be able to pay bills and some taxes even with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other shit coins. I'm not a fan of literally anything beyond the Bitcoin version of this, but I think it's an exciting development to give users that opportunity and that functionality. You still have that hurdle of, well, if you're sitting as a whale on a nice massive stack, every single time you sell some Bitcoin to pay bills, you've also now got to pay taxes on top of that. While the functionality is really cool and interesting, and there are very specific people, I think that this will help. Like Alex McShane definitely could use this functionality, I think, except for the fact that he doesn't own a credit card. You still, though, have the hurdles of the taxes that go in place when you buy and sell Bitcoin. So until that, I think, is removed, I myself am not inclined to now start paying my credit card bill or my water bill or whatever with Bitcoin. But that's just my personal take. Alex, I'd love your thoughts on just the idea of being able to pay bills more easily directly through Bitcoin.
You want to pay for things with your shitty dispensable fiat currency, the local currency. I don't advise it. Being all in on Bitcoin, all in is hard. I think it's better to reserve and have a cash flow for just your month-to-month, day-to-day small expenses, including paying your rent and stuff. Selling Bitcoin sucks, man. It's not, the current tax law suggests that you should buy Bitcoin and you should hold it forever and you should not sell it. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
I'm curious though, like I'm throwing this curveball your way. Don't label me a shitcoiner. Don't.
Okay, yeah, go.
Anything. But would you use your shit coins?
Shitcoiner. Would I use my what? Sorry.
Would you use that Doge bag that I know you're sitting on to pay your bills?
I definitely don't. I don't own any Doge. Would I use a shitcoin to pay my bills?
It's called the US dollar.
Yeah. I guess I've never thought about that because I don't have any shitcoins. I guess if I could, why not? I don't know what else I would do with them. I don't know. This is what do people do with their shitcoins? Just hold? Do they hodl them? They trade them, right?
No, I think they trade them. I mean, I don't know. I don't hold shitcoins aside from the US dollar, which I hold as little as possible that I can get by month to month.
I like to keep shit simple, man. Just hold Bitcoin, buy as much of it as you can, and then just try to like eke out a living on a couple US dollars. Sometimes I do get in a pinch where I've got to liquidate a little Bitcoin, and that always sucks. Make sure you buy back to replace immediately or at a slightly lower price. But unless you're sitting on a pretty comfortable stack, I would not recommend selling any Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself, I know my financial planner was not thrilled when I lumped like back when the pandemic first happened, I lumped like all of my emergency money into Bitcoin back then, and it's paid dividends, like Alex knows. But you know, it was seen risky at the time when they were like, "Why are you taking this safety money?" And now, like, inflation's running rampant, and that money would buy me a lot less had I just lumped it into Bitcoin. So, who's right? Yeah, to Alex's point, if I were to get into trouble or hot water, I might need to sell a little Bitcoin to cover it. But, you know, it's worked out, you know, to each his own, not financial advice.
That's what I had to convince my fiance over a long period of time. I was just like, well, your emergency money is the Bitcoin. This is the money that you don't want to lose. All these dollars are worthless sitting in your bank account. They're just losing purchasing power every day.
My girlfriend has an emergency fund herself with US dollars. And, you know, I mean, I've been trying to convince her to do it, but it's her money. You know, we're not married yet. So in due time, maybe.
Yeah. So she's the checking account in the relationship.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. I know that.
There's always got to be one. There's got to be one.
Yeah.
It's a healthy balance. I mean, look, I'm a very adamant person, and maybe I don't feed into the ecosystem, but like, I am not a fan of selling my Bitcoin. I get really annoyed when I go to places and they're like, "Oh, we're Bitcoin only." And they say it with like this smile on their face as though like I'm pleased by the fact that I now have to figure out like, oh, I have to send you some sats and I want to go rebuy my said sats. And then now I've exposed myself because I'm totally going to get audited for admitting this. I've never written on my tax documents that I own crypto, because that's how they really get you. And like, selling it or sending my Bitcoin elsewhere is how I get fucking dinged, because the main places that I use or transact my Bitcoin are Cash App, not a sponsor, but like, hey Jack, feel free to sponsor us. And also Strike, hey Jack, not a sponsor, but also feel free to sponsor us.
Yo, they sponsor Tales from the Crypt. I'm waiting for that Cash App sponsorship.
Yeah,
I'll wear a Cash App sweater every day of the week if they sponsor us.
Yeah, definitely.
But also like Cash App, release those hoodies. I want one.
For sure. They are sweet. Like I said, the 3 times I've ever paid with Bitcoin, I mean, I've obviously sent Bitcoin to myself to various wallets and done all that before. But the 3 times I spent Bitcoin, I spent Jack Mallers Bitcoin by just putting a little bit of fiat in there and then sending it across the Lightning Network from dollars to Bitcoin to the recipient. They could have taken in any fiat currency if they wanted, but a lot of places they just want to hold the Bitcoin at the conferences and stuff. So I've been very content with using Jack Mallers Bitcoin instead of my Bitcoin. Obviously, you need fiat dollars to do that. But yeah, no, I've had nothing but good experiences not spending my Bitcoin, spending other people's.
I see what you're saying. I don't like that argument. No.
Is there something else I can help with?
Literally go away, Siri. Like, no. That
right.
also further proves that they're always listening to you. For those of you guys who don't realize how that technology works, it is absorbing everything that we have said, and it's waiting for keywords to trigger when it's actually going to respond. So when you joke that, hey, I didn't say that or enter that in my phone, but I said it around my phone, that's because it literally is recording you all the time.
Yeah, and the ultrasonic ultrasound, I can't remember what it's called, but the tracking is real, dude. I was like testing how sharp my katana was the other day, not like privately. I was just like feeling the sharpness of it, and I got like all my Instagram ads are knife sharpening ads now, and I didn't say anything. It's very weird.
Don't worry, Q will have a tax audit now that he admitted to not paying taxes on the Bitcoin he has sold, or not mentioning that he owns crypto or Bitcoin.
Well, I'm just convinced
you don't have to mention it. You don't have to mention it yet. Yeah, I mean, that's not financial advice, but I'm not mentioning it.
Because that's how they're going to get you. They're coming
for everybody, man. You got to keep your Bitcoin off exchanges. They're going to whitelist. You're just going to wake up one day and you're not going to be allowed to withdraw from Coinbase.
Yeah, I had to mention it. Made a mistake, like I said, buying on Robinhood, so I had to report that. But obviously, I sold back to dollars and rebought in. And then the only other thing is I was getting a little bit of interest in BlockFi that I completely forgot about, and so you have to report the interest-bearing nature of that. So those are the only two things that I've mentioned that I've had Bitcoin on or had to report, basically.
Can I admit something to you guys without getting in trouble? Because you saying that, Chris, now I'm like, fuck. So I have like a few ETH, and they're all like just staked on some exchange collecting me interest. Fuck.
Yeah, I mean, they're more kind when you go to them and say, sorry, I messed up, here's a payment. They're less kind when they find it and they say, we need a payment. So that's not financial advice, but I'll let that for you and your tax accountant figure out how to handle that.
Okay, you divulge it and beg forgiveness, and I'm gonna not divulge it and beg forgiveness.
I'm clean. I've done it. I've good riddance with
that much. Though.
Don't you have an accountant though?
Me?
Yeah, you're like a grown up. Like you have don't you have a
I do.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Do you like your? I don't like mine, and I want a new one.
I mean, he's kind of part of the family. He's like cousins with my girlfriend, so he gave me a really good rate, and he's a good family friend. So
okay, never mind.
Get one.
You definitely need one, man.
But why?
I don't want to dox certain things that we've talked about on a recorded live show on YouTube.
All right, we should wrap this up then.
Yeah, I was just thinking that we should wrap
this up. What I will
dox
is the location for Bitcoin 23 is going to be.
You know it?
In the USA.
It does. After such a success last year, I wouldn't take a gamble on any other country.
Yeah.
I can't emphasize this enough. Like so many of you who were in attendance this past year, just not even a month ago, flew into Miami. You're going to fly into wherever we go. Tickets are never going to be this cheap again. $250 for GA, $5,000 for a whale pass. Go get your tickets right now. Presale ends on Friday, right? Yep. Presale ends. We're done tomorrow. And then all of a sudden tickets are going up, and they're just going to keep going up until next year's conference. And let me tell you, if you start complaining and bitching and moaning, oh, tickets are so expensive, this, that, or the other, I don't know. I don't give a shit. You know what? Honestly, I'm gonna tell you this happened because I'm one of these type of people. There were plenty of people in the weeks leading up to the conference where ticket prices were over $1,000 for even the cheapest GA ticket. And they were offering tickets for less than that, but more than the 250 price tag they have now, because some of these people were genuinely buying these tickets to resell them in the secondary markets at a discount versus what our upgrades are. I'm probably going to get in trouble for giving you guys that idea, but feel free to buy multiple tickets if you see fit. And we will absolutely put you in the Discord channels, and you will be able to resell those tickets under a certified ticket resale channel verified by us at Bitcoin Magazine, the Bitcoin conference. So there you go. There's your hot tip for today to make some extra cash so you can stack some sats. Don't go all in on this though. Just make sure you have a ticket for yourself first.
Yeah, if you're in the Bitcoin, I guess you'd call it industry at all with your business, you should probably make the conference a line item. You should probably just allocate a small budget to come every year because you're going to be brushing shoulders with everyone else in the industry. It's great for your career. It's just a great time, great learning experience. It's just kind of a must do. So get your tickets before Friday. So today.
Should we do one last sats drop while we remind everyone also that the limited time Bitcoin 2022 swag is still on sale on our store. Use promo code FOMO to get 10% off of all the swag, none of which any of us are wearing except for this t-shirt. Yeah, that's right. I'm taking my clothes off for this t-shirt. Fun fact,
The first 3 people on that lineup didn't come to the conference. I said, fun fact, half the people on that lineup did not come to the conference.
These are big facts. Big facts.
Truly special t-shirt.
But make sure you guys get your tickets. Make sure you guys follow all 3 of us on Twitter if you're not already. And we'll be back tomorrow. We have an exciting episode tomorrow. We'll be joined by Jimmy Song. And we may or may not be having Jimmy come on pretty often going forward. So hopefully we don't scare him away. Stay humble and stack sats, everyone.